Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed chambers of medieval castles where young women wait nervously as their fathers negotiate their futures with visiting lords. You can almost hear the rustle of silk gowns and the whispered conversations that will determine whether a girl of 14 will marry for love, for land, or for survival. The flickering candlelight reveals documents being signed, dowries being counted, and lives being forever altered by customs so foreign they might seem like fiction. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for about why certain wedding traditions persist even today. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to share where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps tell me what fascinates you most about medieval history. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the great hall of a Norman castle in 1147, watching as 12-year-old Matilda de Clare stands rigidly beside her father while he discusses her marriage prospects with 3 different suitors. Her small hands tremble slightly as she clutches her prayer book, knowing that within the hour, her entire future will be decided by men she barely knows. The youngest suitor is 42, the oldest owns the most land, the middle choice has the strongest military alliances. None of them has asked her preference. Because in this world, a noble woman's primary value lies not in her thoughts or desires, but in her ability to cement political relationships through marriage. The marriage market for aristocratic women operates with ruthless efficiency during these centuries. You observe how fathers treat their daughters like precious commodities to be invested wisely, calculating potential returns on political influence, territorial expansion, and military protection. A well-placed marriage can end conflicts between neighbouring regions, secure trading rights, or strengthen claims to disputed lands. Young Matilda represents not just herself, but her family's entire future prosperity and security. The stakes couldn't be higher when a single marriage alliance might determine whether her family thrives or faces extinction in the brutal politics of medieval Europe. The Great Hall itself tells the story of these power dynamics. Tapestries depicting conquests and victories line the stone walls, while heraldic banners hang from the timber rafters like silent witnesses to generations of strategic unions. The massive fireplace crackles with oak logs, casting dancing shadows that seem to mirror the complex negotiations unfolding around the polished table. Servants glide skillfully between the participants, refilling goblets with imported wine and ensuring that ceremonial swords remain prominently displayed as subtle reminders of the military consequences of these discussions. The negotiations you witness reveal the cold mathematics of medieval alliance building. Her father, William de Clare, spreads parchment maps across the oak table, pointing to strategic locations where his daughter's future children might inherit lands. He discusses her lineage like a horse breeder might examine bloodlines, emphasizing her healthy constitution, her mother's successful bearing of 6 children, and her grandmother's longevity. The suitors nod approvingly, occasionally glancing at Matilda as if assessing livestock at market. One actually requests to examine her teeth, claiming he wants to ensure she'll maintain her appearance long enough to produce multiple heirs. You notice the intricate dance of information that flows through these negotiations. Each party reveals carefully selected details while concealing potential weaknesses. Sir Geoffrey mentions his fertile lands but omits his crushing debts to Italian moneylenders. Lord Reginald boasts of his military victories while downplaying the enemies those conquests have created. Earl Roderick displays his wealth ostentatiously, but says nothing about his 3 previous wives who died in childbirth, or his reputation for violent temper. The art of medieval diplomacy requires reading between lines and interpreting silences as carefully as spoken words. The room fills with the scent of burning wax and spilled wine as discussions grow more heated. You notice how each suitor attempts to outbid the others, not just with gold and lands, but with promises of protection, trading privileges, and military support. Sir Geoffrey offers exclusive access to his Flemish wool markets, knowing that textile trade represents the future of medieval commerce. Lord Reginald promises to garrison 50 knights at William's northern fortress, effectively providing a private army. The elder suitor, Earl Roderick, simply places a leather purse containing 200 silver marks on the table and lets the coins speak for themselves, their weight representing more wealth than most peasants will see in several lifetimes. The conversation reveals fascinating details about medieval economics that you never learned in history class. Marriage negotiations often included provisions for specific trade routes, mining rights, forest privileges for hunting and timber, mill operations, and even the rights to collect tolls from river crossings. These women weren't just acquiring husbands, they were becoming integral components of complex economic networks that stretched across continents. The spice trade, wool commerce, and emerging banking systems all factored into marriage calculations as families positioned themselves for commercial advantage. But you notice something fascinating, despite the apparent callousness. These arrangements often produce surprisingly functional partnerships. Many medieval marriages that began as political calculations evolved into genuine affection and mutual respect. The system, however brutal it seems to modern sensibilities, created stability in a world where warfare, disease, and economic uncertainty constantly threatened survival. A strategic marriage could literally mean the difference between a family's prosperity and destruction. Young women like Matilda often develop strong bonds with husbands who initially seemed like strangers, finding common ground in shared responsibilities and mutual dependence. The Church's growing influence adds complex layers to these negotiations. By the 12th century, ecclesiastical law increasingly requires that both parties consent to marriage, creating tension between spiritual requirements and practical family needs. You watch as priests hover at the edges of these discussions, occasionally interjecting reminders about canonical law, while the nobles largely ignore their theological concerns in favour of territorial considerations. Father Benedict keeps clearing his throat meaningfully whenever the conversation turns too mercenary, but his protests carry little weight against the practical needs of feudal politics. The tension between sacred and secular authority plays out in miniature around this negotiating table. Historians still argue whether medieval women wielded more influence in marriage negotiations than surviving records suggest, particularly through their mothers' behind-the-scenes advocacy and their own subtle resistance to unwanted matches. The process you observe typically unfolds over months or even years. Initial inquiries lead to formal negotiations, which progress to detailed investigations of each family's wealth, reputation, and connections. Spies and intermediaries gather intelligence about potential suitors' characters, their treatment of previous wives, their financial stability, and their military capabilities. Nothing is left to chance in these arrangements that will shape entire dynasties. Background checks in medieval times could be surprisingly thorough, involving testimonies from former servants, interviews with neighbouring lords, and careful examination of financial records going back generations. As evening approaches in the castle, You see Matilda finally dismissed to her chambers, while the men continue negotiating late into the night. Her maid helps her undress, whispering gentle reassurances that mean little against the overwhelming reality of her situation. The stone walls of her chamber seem to close in as she contemplates a future that feels as foreign as the distant lands her potential husband might own. Tomorrow, her fate will be sealed with handshakes and signed agreements, but tonight she lies in her narrow bed wondering whether she'll find happiness in whatever arrangement emerges from those smoky discussions below. The weight of centuries of tradition presses down upon her small frame as she drifts toward an uncertain sleep. Her dreams filled with unknown faces and unfamiliar castles that might become her new home. You drift deeper into the medieval world where an extraordinary legal revolution quietly transforms marriage forever, though few realize its radical implications at the time. The morning after Matilda's negotiations, you find yourself in the scriptorium of Canterbury Cathedral, watching monks carefully copy canonical texts that will reshape how couples unite across Christendom. The scratching of quills on parchment creates a gentle rhythm as these scribes unknowingly document one of history's most significant shifts in human relationships. The Church has declared something revolutionary. Both bride and groom must freely consent to marriage, regardless of what their families demand. This requirement seems almost laughably naive given what you witnessed in the castle the night before. Yet it represents a seismic shift in medieval thinking about personal agency and individual rights. You observe how this new doctrine creates an impossible tension between the practical realities of feudal politics and the spiritual ideals of Christian marriage. Families who have negotiated alliances for months suddenly discover that their carefully crafted agreements can be nullified by a simple no from either party at the altar. The consent controversy begins innocently enough in the early 12th century when church scholars start examining the theological foundations of marriage more rigorously. Pope Alexander III, writing around 1160, declares that marriage springs from the mutual agreement of the couple rather than from parental arrangement or physical consummation. This sounds reasonable until you consider its devastating implications for the entire feudal system, which depends on marriage alliances to maintain political stability and economic order. The papal decree sends shockwaves through noble courts across Europe as centuries of established practice suddenly conflicts with divine law. You witness the practical chaos this creates as you follow a young woman named Eleanor through her betrothal ceremony in 1151. Her father has promised her to a Welsh lord to secure peace on his borderlands, but Eleanor has privately confided to her confessor that she loves a young knight in her father's service. The priest, bound by canonical law, must somehow balance his pastoral duty to honour Eleanor's wishes against the political necessity of the alliance. The ceremony becomes a careful dance of theological interpretation as everyone tries to determine what constitutes genuine consent versus coerced agreement. The great hall where Eleanor's betrothal unfolds feels thick with tension as multiple interests collide. Welsh emissaries stand ready to report back to their lord about whether the alliance will proceed as planned. Eleanor's father paces nervously, knowing that refusal could mean renewed warfare on his borders. Her mother clutches a rosary, praying that her daughter will choose duty over desire. Meanwhile, Eleanor herself stands at the centre of this political storm, suddenly invested with power that no 12-year-old girl in history has ever possessed before. The Church's position creates particularly complex problems for noblewomen like Eleanor, who face enormous family pressure while theoretically possessing the right to refuse unwanted marriages. You watch as her mother takes her aside for what appears to be a gentle conversation about duty and family honour. But the underlying message is clear. Refusal will bring disgrace, poverty, and possible exile from everything she has ever known. The consent requirement becomes a cruel joke when saying no means choosing between spiritual freedom and social suicide. But some young women discover creative ways to exploit this new canonical protection. You observe a fascinating case in southern France where Marguerite de Toulouse repeatedly claims insufficient consent to escape 3 different arranged marriages, each time finding sympathetic priests willing to annul the contracts on grounds of coercion. Her father grows increasingly frustrated as his diplomatic plans collapse, but ecclesiastical courts consistently uphold her right to refuse. She finally marries a troubadour of her own choosing, though the union brings her family no political advantage whatsoever. Her strategy becomes so notorious that other nobles begin including specific anti-Marguerite clauses in their own daughters' marriage contracts. The consent controversy reveals deep philosophical divisions within medieval Christianity itself. Conservative bishops argue that parental authority reflects divine order, and that children who defy their families commit grave sins against the 4th commandment. Progressive theologians counter that forced marriage violates the sacred nature of the marital bond and reduces holy matrimony to mere commercial transaction. You listen to heated debates in cathedral chapters where learned men argue whether love or duty better serves God's will in human relationships. These theological discussions often extend late into the night, with scholars citing everything from Aristotle to Augustine, while attempting to reconcile human nature with divine will. The intellectual complexity of these debates fascinates you, as you observe how medieval thinkers grapple with concepts that won't be fully developed until centuries later. They're essentially debating individual rights, personal autonomy, and the relationship between private desire and social obligation without having the philosophical vocabulary to articulate these ideas clearly. Their arguments often circle back to biblical precedents and classical authorities, creating elaborate justifications for positions that spring from fundamentally modern insights about human nature and personal freedom. Historians still argue whether the Church's consent requirements actually empowered medieval women, or simply created new forms of psychological manipulation that replaced physical coercion with emotional pressure. The practical enforcement of consent proves nearly impossible in most cases. You observe how families adapt to the new requirements by developing increasingly sophisticated methods of persuasion and manipulation. Fathers learn to present arranged marriages as divine callings, rather than parental commands. Mothers craft elaborate narratives about family honour and Christian duty that make refusal seem not just selfish, but sinful. The language changes, but the pressure often remains just as intense as before canonical consent became legally required. Some families even hire sympathetic priests to counsel their daughters about the spiritual benefits of obedience and submission. Some regions develop fascinating workarounds to the consent problem. In parts of Germany, you discover the practice of conditional consent, where young women agree to marriages that will only become valid if certain conditions are met within specific timeframes. This allows families to negotiate alliances while giving daughters escape clauses if the arrangements prove unsatisfactory. The system requires careful legal documentation and creates a new class of ecclesiastical lawyers who specialize in matrimonial contract law. These legal innovations demonstrate medieval creativity in adapting ancient customs to new theological requirements. The consent controversy also creates unexpected opportunities for romantic rebellion. You follow the story of Isabella of Angoulême, who uses canonical consent requirements to escape an arranged marriage to an elderly French count, and instead elopes with King John of England in 1200. Her dramatic refusal at the altar becomes legendary, inspiring other young noble women to consider whether they might also choose love over duty. The political consequences prove enormous as her rejected suitor allies with France against England. But Isabella's personal victory demonstrates the revolutionary potential of the Church's position. You notice how the consent requirement gradually transforms the actual marriage ceremony itself. Priests begin asking explicit questions about willingness and coercion during wedding services. The traditional exchange of vows evolves to emphasize personal choice and mutual commitment rather than family alliance and social duty. Wedding liturgies start including prayers for the couple's happiness and compatibility, concepts that had been largely irrelevant when marriages were purely political arrangements. The very words spoken during ceremonies shift to acknowledge the bride and groom as individuals rather than mere representatives of their families. The most intriguing aspect of the consent controversy is how it creates space for genuine affection to develop within arranged marriages. You observe couples who might never have chosen each other, but who find unexpected compatibility once they accept their situations without resentment. The knowledge that they could theoretically refuse seems to make acceptance more palatable. Even when practical considerations make refusal impossible, the psychological impact of theoretical choice proves almost as significant as actual freedom would have been. By the end of the 12th century, the consent requirement has become firmly established in canon law, though its enforcement remains inconsistent and often politically motivated. You witness how wealthy families learn to work within the system while poor families often ignore it entirely, creating a two-tiered approach to marriage that persists for centuries. The revolutionary principle of mutual consent plants seeds that will eventually grow into modern concepts of romantic love and personal autonomy, though such developments remain centuries in the future as medieval society struggles to balance individual desires with collective needs. You wake to the sound of coins clinking in leather pouches as medieval fathers begin the complex calculations that will determine their daughters' futures through dowry negotiations. The morning light filters through thick glass windows as you observe William de Clare hunched over his account books, quill scratching across parchment as he tallies the enormous sums required to secure advantageous marriages for his 3 daughters. The air smells of ink and anxiety as he realizes that marrying off his girls properly might bankrupt his estate. Yet failing to provide adequate dowries could doom them to spinsterhood or disgraceful unions beneath their station. Do you remember young Matilda from the negotiations you witnessed earlier? Her father now faces the sobering reality of translating those political promises into actual wealth transfers. Medieval dowries represent far more than simple money changing hands. They constitute complex financial instruments that reshape entire family economies for generations. You watch as William struggles to balance immediate cash payments, property transfers, future inheritance rights, and ongoing financial obligations that will bind his family to his daughter's husbands long after the wedding celebrations end. The dowry system operates on principles that seem almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Fathers essentially purchase social positions for their daughters by transferring substantial portions of family wealth to prospective husbands. But this isn't simply buying a husband. It's investing in a daughter's future security, social status, and economic protection in a world where women possess few independent means of survival. The dowry becomes her insurance policy, her social safety net, and her contribution to the new household she'll join. You discover that dowry negotiations require extraordinary financial sophistication as families calculate not just immediate payments but complex long-term arrangements. William must consider liquid assets versus property transfers, immediate versus deferred payments, and the intricate legal mechanisms that will protect his daughter's interests throughout her married life. Medieval marriage contracts often span dozens of pages detailing precisely which assets transfer when, under what conditions they might revert to the bride's family, and how they'll be managed during the marriage. The calculations you observe reveal fascinating insights into medieval economics that rarely appear in history books. William evaluates his daughter's dowry potential by analysing grain yields from his estates, projected income from his mill operations, potential profits from his wool trade arrangements, and even speculative investments in emerging commercial ventures. Marrying off daughters requires the same business acumen as any major commercial enterprise, with similar risks and potential returns, but medieval mothers play equally crucial roles in these financial preparations, though their contributions often remain invisible in formal records. You watch as Lady Eleanor de Clare quietly inventories her personal treasures, deciding which pieces of jewellery hold, which bolts of imported fabric, and which precious household items will accompany Matilda to a new home. These seemingly domestic contributions often represent substantial wealth, particularly rare items like Byzantine silks, Venetian glass, or illuminated prayer books that demonstrate both affluence and cultural sophistication. The emotional weight of dowry preparation becomes apparent as you observe Lady Eleanor secretly weeping over her jewellery box. Each piece she designates for Matilda's dowry carries memories of her own marriage, her mother's legacy, or significant family occasions. The golden pendant she received on her wedding day must now ensure her daughter's security. The pearl necklace inherited from her grandmother becomes currency in negotiations she never imagined when she first clasped it around her own neck decades earlier. Regional variations in dowry customs create additional complexity for families with holdings in multiple areas. You follow William as he consults with legal advisors about how English dowry law differs from Norman customs, which differ again from practices in his wife's ancestral lands in Aquitaine. Each jurisdiction maintains different rules about property ownership, inheritance rights, and the legal status of dowry assets. A single marriage negotiation might require expertise in 3 different legal systems and compliance with multiple sets of customs and regulations. Historians still argue whether the dowry system ultimately empowered or disadvantaged medieval women, with some viewing it as economic protection and others as a form of commodification that reduced women to their financial value. The timeline of dowry assembly often extends over many years as families accumulate assets specifically designated for daughters' marriages. You observe how William began setting aside resources for Matilda's dowry when she was barely 5 years old, carefully investing in properties and commercial ventures that would mature by the time she reached marriageable age. This long-term planning requires remarkable foresight and financial discipline, particularly given the economic uncertainties of medieval life where crop failures, political upheavals, or military defeats could destroy years of careful accumulation. The social pressure surrounding dowry adequacy creates intense anxiety for medieval families. You witness heated discussions in noble households about maintaining family honour through generous dowries while avoiding financial ruin. Inadequate dowries bring shame that can affect not just the immediate marriage prospects, but the reputation and future opportunities of siblings and even subsequent generations. Families often stretch their resources to dangerous limits rather than accept the social consequences of appearing financially weak or uncommitted to their daughter's welfare. Some families develop creative financing arrangements to manage dowry obligations. You discover fascinating practices like dowry sharing between multiple families, where several fathers pool resources to arrange marriages for their daughters with the same powerful family. Others create elaborate loan arrangements with monasteries or merchant guilds, using dowry obligations as collateral for commercial investments that might generate the necessary funds. These financial innovations demonstrate remarkable sophistication in medieval economic thinking. The dowry negotiation process itself becomes a delicate diplomatic dance where families signal their wealth and commitment while attempting to extract maximum concessions from prospective bridegrooms. You observe how William's representatives gradually reveal information about Matilda's dowry package, strategically timing disclosures to maintain negotiating leverage. They might mention the cash component early to demonstrate liquidity, then surprise suitors with valuable property transfers or advantageous commercial rights that weren't initially apparent. The legal documentation of dowry agreements requires specialized expertise from clerks trained in both secular and canonical law. You watch as scribes carefully draft contracts that must satisfy multiple legal jurisdictions while protecting the interests of all parties involved. These documents specify not just what assets transfer when, but detailed provisions for various contingencies. What happens if the bride dies childless? How the dowry properties are managed during the marriage? What rights the bride retains to her dowry assets? And under what circumstances dowry items might revert to her birth family? The most fascinating aspect of dowry negotiations is how they reveal the complex web of relationships that bind medieval society together. Matilda's dowry doesn't just represent her father's wealth, it reflects generations of family accumulation, marriage alliances, commercial partnerships, and political relationships. The lands designated for her dowry carry histories of conquest, inheritance, marriage, and negotiation stretching back centuries. Her marriage will add another layer to this palimpsest of human relationships inscribed in property ownership and wealth transfer. As evening approaches, you see William finally closing his account books with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The numbers work, barely, but committing to Matilda's dowry will require careful management of his remaining resources and considerable faith in his ability to arrange equally advantageous marriages for his two younger daughters. The weight of financial obligation settles over the household like morning mist as everyone contemplates the enormous sums that will soon change hands in the name of love, politics, and family honour. You find yourself transported to the rose garden of the De Clare Manor on a crisp autumn morning in 1148, where elaborate betrothal rituals are about to transform legal agreements into sacred bonds that will govern lives for decades to come. The scent of late-blooming flowers mingles with incense as servants arrange ceremonial objects with meticulous precision, each item carrying symbolic weight that makes this moment far more significant than a simple engagement announcement. Young Matilda, now 13, stands nervously beside her mother as they prepare for ceremonies that will legally bind her to a man she has met only twice. Though their union won't be consummated for several years, the betrothal process you're witnessing represents one of medieval society's most sophisticated legal innovations, creating binding contracts between families while acknowledging the Church's requirement for eventual consent. These ceremonies serve multiple functions simultaneously. They formalize political alliances, create legal obligations, establish property transfers, and begin the gradual process of psychological preparation that will help young people accept their predetermined futures. The elaborate rituals also provide face-saving mechanisms for families if circumstances change before the actual wedding occurs. The morning begins with the exchange of symbolic gifts that carry deeper meaning than their material value suggests. You watch as Lord Reginald, the successful suitor, presents Matilda with a golden ring set with sapphires that represents his promise to provide for her material needs throughout their marriage. She reciprocates by offering him an embroidered silk purse containing a lock of her hair, symbolizing her commitment to fidelity and submission. These seemingly simple exchanges create legally binding obligations that both families will struggle to break without serious consequences. The ceremony itself unfolds with choreographed precision that leaves nothing to chance. Father Benedict reads lengthy passages from canonical texts establishing the theological foundations of Christian marriage, while secular officials document the legal agreements that will govern property transfers and inheritance rights. You observe how the ritual seamlessly blends sacred and profane elements, creating bonds that satisfy both spiritual and material requirements of medieval society. The participants move through prescribed actions with solemn dignity, aware that each gesture carries legal and social significance, but betrothal ceremonies also create fascinating opportunities for subtle resistance and negotiation. You notice how Matilda manages to communicate her feelings through barely perceptible gestures that only other women recognize her. When she places the ring on her finger, slightly askew, her mother immediately understands this as a signal of reluctance and subtly adjusts it while whispering reassurances. These tiny acts of defiance and support create underground networks of female communication that operate beneath the surface of official proceedings. The presence of witnesses transforms these ceremonies into community events that bind not just the immediate families, but entire social networks to support the emerging alliance. You observe how carefully the guest list has been constructed to include representatives from all the political factions that might benefit from or threaten the marriage agreement. Each witness becomes partially responsible for ensuring that the betrothal proceeds smoothly toward marriage, creating collective pressure that makes abandonment difficult even if circumstances change dramatically. The legal complexity of betrothal agreements requires extensive documentation that reveals fascinating details about medieval contract law. You examine elaborate scrolls that specify not just the obvious elements like dowry amounts and wedding dates, but intricate provisions for unexpected contingencies. What happens if either party dies before the wedding? How are dowry obligations affected if political circumstances change? What rights do the families retain if the betrothal is dissolved for canonical reasons? These contracts demonstrate remarkable sophistication in anticipating and managing uncertainty. Regional variations in betrothal customs create additional layers of meaning and complexity. In Norman territories, you discover the practice of handfasting, where couples clasp hands while reciting vows that create immediate legal obligations even though consummation remains years in the future. French customs emphasize the exchange of written promises that both parties must sign in the presence of ecclesiastical authorities. Germanic traditions include ritualized combat demonstrations where prospective bridegrooms prove their ability to protect their future wives through displays of martial skill. Historians still argue whether elaborate betrothal ceremonies actually eased the psychological burden of arranged marriages by providing time for gradual acceptance, or whether they simply prolonged the anxiety and uncertainty that young people experienced while awaiting their predetermined fates. The timing of betrothal ceremonies reflects careful calculations about optimal political and economic conditions. You observe how William de Clare has strategically scheduled Matilda's betrothal to coincide with a period of relative peace between England and France, ensuring that the alliance will be seen as strengthening rather than threatening existing political relationships. The ceremony occurs during Chill harvest season when the family's wealth is most apparent, demonstrating their ability to fulfill dowry obligations without appearing financially strained. The psychological impact of betrothal on young participants varies dramatically based on their personalities and circumstances. You watch as Matilda alternates between moments of excitement about her elevated status and periods of profound anxiety about leaving everything familiar. The betrothal ring on her finger serves as a constant reminder of her changed circumstances, marking her transition from daughter to bride-in-waiting. Some young women find comfort in the certainty that betrothal provides, while others experience it as a form of gentle imprisonment that constrains their remaining freedom. The role of mothers during betrothal ceremonies often proves more significant than formal records suggest. You observe Lady Eleanor coaching Matilda through the emotional complexities of accepting her situation with grace, while secretly grieving the loss of her daughter's childhood. Mothers carry the impossible burden of preparing daughters for marriages they might privately oppose, while maintaining family loyalty and social expectations. Their whispered advice and hidden tears create intimate spaces of female solidarity within patriarchal structures. The ecclesiastical aspects of betrothal create interesting tensions between church doctrine and practical family needs. Father Benedict must balance his pastoral responsibility to ensure genuine consent with his understanding of the political necessities that drive these arrangements. You watch as he carefully phrases his questions to give Matilda theoretical opportunities to refuse, while making clear that such refusal would have devastating consequences for everyone involved. The Church's requirement for consent becomes a theological fig leaf that covers the essentially coercive nature of most arranged marriages. The feast that follows the formal betrothal ceremony reveals how these events function as elaborate displays of family wealth and social connections. You observe tables groaning under the weight of imported delicacies, rare wines, and elaborate confections that demonstrate the host family's ability to provide lavish hospitality. The guest list reads like a directory of regional political power, with each invitation carefully calculated to reinforce existing alliances while potentially creating new opportunities for future cooperation. The symbolic elements of betrothal feasts carry messages that extend far beyond mere celebration. Specific dishes appear on the menu because they represent fertility, prosperity, or military strength. The arrangement of seating reflects complex hierarchies of social precedents that acknowledge political realities while subtly promoting the host family's aspirations. Even the entertainment carries meaning, with musicians performing songs that celebrate legendary marriages and happy unions while carefully avoiding ballads about tragic love or failed alliances. As the day concludes, you witness the private moments when families begin adjusting to the new realities that betrothal has created. Matilda removes her ceremonial clothing with the help of servants who understand that they are dressing a different person than they clothed that morning. The young woman who emerged from the betrothal ceremony carries legal obligations, social expectations, and personal anxieties that will shape every aspect of her remaining adolescence. The elaborate rituals have successfully transformed a child into a bride-in-waiting, though the emotional work of accepting that transformation has only just begun. You step into the shadowed corridors of medieval understanding where the concept of childhood blurs into adulthood with startling abruptness, and society's determination of when a girl becomes marriageable follows logic that seems both ancient and alien to modern sensibilities. The morning sun illuminates a scene in the De Clare household where 12-year-old Matilda's younger sister, Agnes, receives her first lessons in household management while their 8-year-old sister, Constance, still plays with wooden dolls. The transition between these stages of life happens not gradually, but in decisive moments when families declare their daughters ready for the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. Medieval society operates on the assumption that physical capability equals emotional readiness, a philosophy that produces some of history's youngest brides and most premature transitions to adult responsibilities. You observe how families evaluate their daughters' marriageability through a combination of physical development, social deportment, and practical skills rather than psychological maturity or personal desire. The onset of menstruation signals not just biological development but immediate availability for marriage negotiations, transforming children into commodities virtually overnight. The Church establishes minimum canonical ages for marriage that seem shockingly young by contemporary standards, 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but you discover that these represent flaws rather than typical practice, with many families arranging marriages for even younger children while delaying consummation until the canonical minimums are reached. This creates the peculiar medieval institution of child brides who legally belong to their husbands while remaining physically and emotionally children for years after their wedding ceremonies. The determination of marriageability involves careful observation of multiple factors that extend far beyond simple chronological age. You watch as Lady Eleanor examines her daughters with the calculating eye of a livestock breeder, noting not just physical development but behavioural indicators that suggest readiness for adult responsibilities. Can the girl manage complex household tasks without supervision? Does she demonstrate appropriate deference to male authority? Has she learned to control emotional displays that might embarrass her future family? These assessments often prove more significant than actual age in determining marriage timing. Regional and class variations in marriageability standards create fascinating disparities in how different communities define childhood's end. Among the nobility, girls like Matilda often marry between 12 and 16 because their families can afford extended courtship periods and gradual transitions to married life. Peasant girls typically work alongside adults from early childhood and may be considered ready for marriage and household management as young as 10 or 11, though their families often lack resources for elaborate wedding celebrations or extended betrothal periods. The economic realities of medieval life profoundly influence calculations about optimal marriage timing. You observe how families balance the costs of maintaining unmarried daughters against the benefits of their domestic labour and the strategic timing of dowry transfers. Daughters who remain unmarried too long become financial burdens and sources of social embarrassment, but those who marry too young might not be physically ready for the childbearing that validates their marriages. Finding the perfect balance requires careful consideration of family resources, political circumstances, and individual characteristics. But the psychological preparation for early marriage receives surprisingly sophisticated attention from medieval mothers and other female relatives. You discover elaborate systems of gradual education that attempt to prepare young girls for adult responsibilities without overwhelming them with information they are not yet ready to process. Lady Eleanor begins teaching Matilda about household management, herb cultivation, and basic medical care when she's barely 10, gradually building competencies that will serve her throughout married life. The training process reveals fascinating insights into medieval gender roles and expectations. You watch as young girls learn not just practical skills like spinning, weaving, and food preservation, but also subtle arts of diplomacy, negotiation, and household politics that will prove essential in managing complex medieval estates. These educational processes acknowledge that medieval wives often functioned as business partners rather than simple domestic servants, requiring genuine competence in multiple areas of estate management. Historians still argue whether early marriage ages in medieval society reflected practical necessity, cultural conditioning, or genuine belief that young people matured faster than their modern counterparts, with evidence supporting elements of all three explanations. The physical preparation for early marriage includes medical practices that seem both sensible and disturbing from contemporary perspectives. You observe how medieval physicians and midwives examine young girls to determine their readiness for sexual activity and childbearing. using knowledge of anatomy and development that often proves remarkably accurate despite limitations in medical understanding. These examinations serve both protective and exploitative functions, potentially preventing physically damaging early marriages while also reducing young women to their reproductive potential. The emotional support systems that surround young brides reveal sophisticated understanding of the psychological challenges involved in early marriage. You discover networks of older women who take responsibility for guiding newly married girls through the emotional adjustments required by their changed circumstances. These informal mentorship relationships often prove more valuable than formal religious instruction in helping young women develop coping strategies for marriages that begin before emotional maturity. The legal protections available to young married women vary dramatically based on family connections, economic resources, and regional customs. You observe how some jurisdictions develop surprisingly progressive protections against physical abuse and sexual exploitation of child brides, while others treat young wives as property with virtually no independent rights. The inconsistency of these protections creates situations where identical marriages might be experienced very differently depending on geographic location and family attitudes. The social consequences of delayed marriage create intense pressure on families to arrange unions for their daughters within acceptable age ranges. You witness the growing anxiety that surrounds unmarried women in their late teens, who are increasingly viewed as damaged goods that will require larger dowries to attract suitable husbands. The stigma attached to prolonged spinsterhood often forces families into disadvantageous marriages rather than risk their daughters' complete unmarriageability. The international aspects of medieval marriage markets create additional complexity around age and readiness standards. You discover how families with holdings in multiple countries must navigate different legal systems and cultural expectations when arranging marriages for their daughters. A girl who might be considered too young for marriage in one region could be viewed as approaching spinsterhood in another, creating strategic decisions about where and when to seek appropriate matches. The documentation of marriageability decisions reveals fascinating glimpses into medieval family psychology and decision-making processes. You examine private letters where mothers agonize over whether their daughters are truly ready for marriage. Balancing protective instincts against social pressures and economic necessities. These intimate communications demonstrate that medieval parents often shared contemporary concerns about their children's welfare, even when their available options remained severely constrained by social circumstances. The religious dimensions of early marriage create complex theological questions about the nature of consent, spiritual development, and moral responsibility. You observe how medieval clergy struggle to reconcile canonical requirements for genuine consent with practical recognition that most young brides lack the life experience necessary for truly informed decision-making. These contradictions produce elaborate justifications for practices that many religious authorities privately question, but feel powerless to change. As you watch young Agnes receive increasingly serious instruction in adult responsibilities, while Constance continues her childhood games, the arbitrary nature of these transitions becomes apparent. The line between child and woman depends more on family convenience and social pressure than on any objective assessment of readiness or capability. Yet within these constraints, you also observe remarkable resilience and adaptability as young women find ways to thrive in circumstances that would overwhelm many modern adults. The medieval approach to marriageability may seem harsh and premature, but it also demonstrates human capacity for growth and adaptation under even the most challenging circumstances. You find yourself standing in the nave of a magnificent cathedral in Canterbury on a crisp morning in 1149, witnessing the transformation of marriage from an intimate family arrangement into a grand public spectacle that will define Christian matrimony for centuries to come. The morning light streams through stained glass windows as you observe preparations for what represents a revolutionary shift in how medieval society celebrates the union of souls. The ceremony you're about to witness marks the culmination of the Church's centuries-long campaign to claim spiritual authority over marriage, wresting control from families and secular authorities to create rituals that emphasize divine blessing over political convenience. Do you remember the private negotiations and family-centered arrangements you witnessed in earlier scenes? Now you see how the Church has gradually inserted itself into every aspect of the marriage process, transforming what was once primarily a legal and economic transaction into a sacred sacrament that requires ecclesiastical supervision and divine sanction. This evolution didn't happen overnight, but developed through centuries of theological debate, political maneuvering, and practical adaptation that ultimately reshaped the fundamental nature of how couples unite in medieval society. The wedding ceremony you observe represents the flowering of liturgical innovation that began in the early 11th century, when church authorities started developing standardized rituals for blessing marriages. You watch as Bishop Geoffrey of Canterbury performs rites that combine ancient Roman legal traditions, Germanic tribal customs, and Christian theological innovations into a coherent ceremony that satisfies multiple constituencies while asserting clerical authority over the proceedings. The result is a magnificent theatrical performance that transforms legal contracts into sacred mysteries. The physical setting of the ceremony demonstrates the Church's determination to claim marriage as fundamentally religious, rather than merely social or economic. You observe how the cathedral's soaring architecture, elaborate decorations, and sacred atmosphere create a sense of divine presence that dwarfs the human participants and emphasizes the spiritual dimensions of their union. The couple stands before the high altar where the Eucharist is celebrated, symbolically linking their marriage to Christ's relationship with the Church in ways that, earlier, family-centered ceremonies never attempted. The development of wedding liturgy reveals fascinating insights into medieval theological thinking about the nature of marriage itself. You listen as Bishop Geoffrey recites prayers that emphasize the divinely ordained nature of matrimony, while carefully balancing themes of mutual submission and male authority that reflect broader social hierarchies. The words spoken during the ceremony create theological frameworks that will govern how couples understand their relationships for the remainder of their lives, transforming marriage from practical partnership into sacred vocation. The ritual elements of the wedding ceremony carry symbolic meanings for meanings that extend far beyond their apparent simplicity. You watch as Matilda and Lord Reginald exchange rings that represent not just mutual commitment, but the circular nature of divine love and the unbroken bonds that marriage creates between souls. The joining of hands during the ceremony symbolizes the unity of wills that the Church considers essential for valid marriage, while the priest's blessing invokes divine protection over the new household being established. But the evolution of wedding ceremonies also reflects ongoing tensions between clerical ideals and social realities that create fascinating contradictions within the rituals themselves. You observe how the ceremony simultaneously emphasizes the couple's free consent, while occurring within a context where such consent is largely theoretical due to family pressure and social constraints. The liturgy celebrates spiritual equality between bride and groom, while reinforcing gender hierarchies that give husbands authority over their wives in all practical matters. The music and artistic elements of wedding ceremonies develop into sophisticated expressions of medieval aesthetic sensibilities and theological understanding. You listen as trained choirs perform elaborate polyphonic settings of biblical texts about love and marriage. creating auditory experiences that elevate the emotions and suggest divine participation in earthly events. The visual arts contribute equally to the ceremonial impact, with elaborate vestments, precious metalwork, and illuminated manuscripts creating environments of overwhelming beauty and spiritual significance. Historians still argue whether the Church's capture of marriage ceremonies actually improved women's status by emphasizing spiritual equality, or simply provided religious justification for existing social hierarchies that subordinated wives to their husband's authority. The social aspects of church weddings create new dynamics around public celebration and community involvement that transform marriage from private family affair into neighbourhood event. You observe how the ceremony brings together diverse social groups who might otherwise have little interaction. Nobles and peasants, clergy and lay people, family members and political allies all gather to witness and validate the union. This public character makes marriage dissolution more difficult while creating community pressure to support couples through difficulties. The economic implications of elaborate church weddings add significant cost to the marriage process while creating new opportunities for ecclesiastical revenue generation. You watch as families negotiate with church authorities about ceremonial fees, special decorations, musical performances, and celebratory feasts that can rival the dowry itself in total expense. The Church's monopoly on legitimate marriage creates captive market conditions that allow clerical authorities to charge substantial fees for services that families cannot obtain elsewhere. The regional variations in wedding ceremonies reflect the gradual and uneven process through which the Church established control over marriage practices across medieval Europe. You discover that English ceremonies emphasize different elements than French rituals, which differ again from Germanic or Mediterranean traditions. These variations demonstrate how local customs influence the development of supposedly universal Christian practices, creating rich diversity within apparent uniformity of doctrine and liturgy. The timing and seasonality of church weddings reveal fascinating insights into medieval attitudes about auspicious occasions and spiritual preparation. You learn that the Church discourages marriages during Lent, Advent, and other penitential seasons, while promoting ceremonies during periods associated with joy and celebration. These restrictions create seasonal patterns in wedding activity that influence everything from agricultural planning to social calendars, demonstrating how a religious authority shapes the rhythm of medieval life. The documentation requirements for church marriages create unprecedented levels of bureaucratic oversight that transform matrimony into an administrative process requiring extensive record-keeping and legal compliance. You observe scribes carefully recording details about the ceremony, the participants, the witnesses, and the various agreements that accompany the religious rites. These records serve multiple functions. They provide legal proof of valid marriage, they document property transfers and inheritance rights, and they create archives that future generations will use to verify genealogical claims and social status. The international character of the medieval church creates opportunities for standardization in marriage practices that transcend political boundaries and cultural differences. You witness how a wedding ceremony in England follows essentially the same pattern as one in France or Germany, reflecting the Church's success in creating truly universal Christian practices that unite diverse populations under common religious authority. This standardization facilitates international marriages and creates shared cultural references that strengthen European Christian identity. The theological education that accompanies church weddings introduces ordinary lay people to sophisticated concepts about the nature of love, commitment, and spiritual development that might otherwise remain confined to clerical circles. You listen as priests explain the symbolic meanings of ceremonial elements, while connecting earthly marriage to divine mysteries that give everyday relationships cosmic significance. This educational component transforms wedding ceremonies into religious instruction that shapes how participants understand their ongoing responsibilities and opportunities. As the ceremony concludes with elaborate blessings and community celebration, you observe how the Church has successfully transformed marriage from primarily secular transaction into fundamentally sacred event that requires ongoing spiritual attention and ecclesiastical oversight. The couple who emerges from the cathedral carries not just legal obligations and social expectations, but spiritual responsibilities that will govern their relationship until death separates them. The revolution in wedding ceremonies represents the Church's broader campaign to Christianize medieval society by claiming authority over life's most significant transitions and transforming them into opportunities for religious education and spiritual development. You enter the hushed chambers of a medieval manor house as twilight descends on the wedding day, where flickering candles cast nervous shadows across tapestried walls and the air grows thick with anticipation, anxiety, and the weight of expectations that have followed young brides to their marriage beds for centuries. The wedding feast has ended. The guests have departed with knowing glances and ribald jokes, and now you witness one of medieval society's most ritualized yet intensely private moments, the wedding night that will determine not just personal happiness, but political alliances, inheritance rights, and family honour for generations to come. The preparations for this moment began days earlier, with elaborate rituals designed to ensure fertility, divine blessing, and irrefutable proof of consummation that will satisfy both families and legal authorities. You observe Lady Eleanor nervously supervising the preparation of the bridal chamber, where servants arrange blessed herbs beneath the mattress, hang protective amulets near the bed, and ensure that every detail conforms to traditions believed to influence the couple's future happiness and reproductive success. The room itself becomes a stage where private intimacy intersects with public expectations in ways that transform personal experience into political theatre. The doctrine of consummation carries enormous legal and social significance that extends far beyond the couple's personal relationship. You discover that medieval law considers marriage incomplete until physical union occurs, creating situations where unconsummated marriages can be annulled even years after the wedding ceremony. This requirement places tremendous pressure on young couples, particularly brides who must navigate the complex transition from childhood innocence to adult sexuality while knowing that their performance will be scrutinized and evaluated by family members, legal authorities, and religious advisors. The medical and practical advice available to medieval brides reveals fascinating insights into contemporary understanding of female sexuality and reproduction. You listen as experienced matrons whisper instructions to nervous young women about techniques for managing pain, encouraging conception, and satisfying husbands whose own sexual education may be equally limited. These conversations blend genuine medical knowledge with superstition, practical wisdom with religious doctrine, creating educational systems that attempt to prepare girls for experiences that no amount of instruction can truly anticipate. But the psychological dimensions of the wedding night often prove more challenging than the physical aspects, particularly for brides who have had little previous contact with their husbands and minimal preparation for intimate relationships. You watch as 13-year-old Matilda sits motionless while her mother attempts to provide last-minute guidance about submission, patience, and the importance of concealing fear or reluctance that might interfere with successful consummation. The burden of ensuring marital success falls disproportionately on brides who must manage their own emotions while adapting to their husband's expectations and desires. The role of witnesses and verification in medieval consummation creates bizarre situations where private intimacy becomes subject to semi-public oversight designed to prevent later disputes about marriage validity. You observe preparations for the bedding ceremony, where family representatives will escort the couple to their chamber, offer formal blessings, and sometimes remain nearby to confirm that consummation has occurred. These traditions reflect the fundamentally political nature of medieval marriage, where personal relationships serve a broader family and social interests that require external validation. The religious dimensions of consummation create complex theological questions about the relationship between spiritual union and physical intimacy that medieval clergy struggle to resolve satisfactorily. You listen as Father Benedict offers prayers for the couple's happiness, while carefully avoiding explicit discussion of sexual activity that the Church simultaneously considers necessary for valid marriage and inherently sinful outside specific reproductive purposes. These contradictions produce elaborate justifications for practices that many religious authorities find theologically problematic but socially essential. Regional variations in wedding night customs demonstrate the diverse ways that different cultures attempt to manage the transition from public celebration to private intimacy. You discover that Norman traditions emphasize ceremonial aspects that affirm family honor, while Saxon customs focus more on practical preparations for successful marriage. Mediterranean practices include elaborate fertility rituals that invoke ancient goddesses alongside Christian saints, creating syncretic traditions that blend pagan and Christian elements in fascinating combinations. Historians still argue whether medieval wedding night rituals actually eased psychological adjustment to marriage, or simply created additional stress for young couples already overwhelmed by the transition from childhood to adult responsibilities and intimate relationships with virtual strangers. The economic implications of successful consummation extend far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass inheritance rights, property transfers, and political alliances that depend on the marriage being legally complete and potentially fertile. You observe how families calculate the financial consequences of failed consummation, including potential dowry returns, alliance disruptions, and reputation damage that could affect future marriage negotiations for siblings and relatives. The wedding night becomes a business transaction as much as a personal experience, with success or failure measured in dynastic rather than individual terms. The medical knowledge surrounding consummation reveals both sophisticated understanding and dangerous ignorance about human sexuality and reproduction. You discover that medieval physicians possess accurate anatomical knowledge about sexual function, while maintaining bizarre theories about conception that lead to practices designed to ensure pregnancy through positioning and timing and dietary interventions. These medical traditions create elaborate protocols for wedding night behavior that attempt to maximize fertility while managing physical and emotional challenges. The support systems available to new brides during this transition vary dramatically based on family attitudes, regional customs, and individual circumstances. You watch as some mothers provide detailed guidance and emotional support that helps daughters navigate the challenges of intimate marriage, while others offer minimal preparation that leaves young women to discover essential information through painful trial and error. The quality of this support often determines whether young wives develop positive or traumatic associations with marital sexuality that will affect their relationships for decades. The documentation requirements surrounding consummation create uncomfortable intersections between private experience and legal necessity that force couples to provide evidence of intimate activities to satisfy ecclesiastical and secular authorities. You observe scribes carefully recording witness testimony about the couple's entry into their chamber, the sounds heard from within, and the physical evidence discovered afterward. These records serve as essential legal functions, while creating invasive oversight of personal relationships that transforms wedding nights into semi-public events. The contraceptive knowledge available to medieval women remains limited and often dangerous, creating situations where successful consummation may lead to pregnancies that young wives are not physically or emotionally prepared to manage. You discover various herbal preparations and mechanical devices that women use to prevent conception while maintaining the appearance of sexual availability. Though these methods often prove ineffective or harmful, the tension between reproductive expectations and personal readiness creates ongoing anxiety that extends far beyond the wedding night itself. The cultural mythology surrounding wedding night creates unrealistic expectations and unnecessary anxiety for couples who must navigate intimate relationships while conforming to social scripts that may bear little relationship to their personal experiences or desires. You observe how troubadour songs, religious instruction, and family advice create competing narratives about marital sexuality that leave young people confused about appropriate behaviour and realistic expectations for their own relationships. As dawn breaks over the manor house, you witness the formal verification of consummation that will confirm the marriage's validity and set in motion the legal and social processes that will govern the couple's future together. The blood-stained sheets displayed for family inspection represent not just physical proof of successful union but symbolic evidence of dynastic continuity, political alliance, and social order that extends far beyond the personal experience of two young people who have just begun learning to navigate intimate partnership within the constraints of medieval society's expectations and requirements. You awaken to the gentle tolling of chapel bells as dawn breaks over the medieval manor, where a new bride begins her first full day of married life, navigating a labyrinth of expectations, responsibilities, and social adjustments that will determine her happiness and success for decades to come. The morning light reveals Matilda moving carefully through unfamiliar corridors as she learns the rhythms of her new household, every gesture watched and evaluated by servants, relatives, and her husband himself, all of whom have opinions about how a proper wife should conduct herself in her transformed circumstances. The transition from daughter to wife represents one of medieval society's most dramatic role changes, requiring young women to master entirely new sets of skills, relationships, and responsibilities while adapting to households that may operate according to completely different customs and expectations than their birth families. You observe Matilda attempting to balance deference to her new mother-in-law with authority over household servants, learning to manage relationships that can determine whether her married life becomes harmonious or perpetually conflict-ridden. The daily schedule of a medieval wife reveals the enormous scope of responsibilities that fall to women who manage complex household economies while maintaining the social relationships essential for family prosperity and political security. You follow Matilda through her morning routine as she supervises food preparation for dozens of household members, reviews inventory of stored goods, meets with stewards about estate management, and receives reports from various craftspeople and agricultural workers whose activities she must coordinate. The medieval housewife functions as chief executive of an enterprise that would challenge modern business managers. The learning curve for household management proves particularly steep for young brides who must quickly master skills that take years to develop properly. You watch as Matilda struggles to understand the complex systems for food preservation, textile production, herbal medicine preparation, and financial record-keeping that her predecessors spent decades perfecting. Mistakes in any of these areas can have serious consequences for family health, economic stability, and social reputation, creating enormous pressure on inexperienced wives to achieve competence rapidly. But the most delicate aspect of early married life involves learning to manage the intimate relationship with a husband who may be equally inexperienced in navigating marriage dynamics. You observe the careful dance of communication between Matilda and Lord Reginald as they attempt to establish patterns of interaction that satisfy both their personal needs and social expectations about appropriate spousal behaviour. These negotiations occur largely through subtle signals and indirect communication that require sophisticated emotional intelligence to interpret accurately. The support systems available to new wives vary dramatically based on family dynamics, regional customs, and individual personalities, with some young women receiving extensive guidance, while others must navigate marriage challenges largely alone. You discover that Matilda's mother-in-law, Lady Adelheid, views her son's new wife as a potential threat to her own household authority and provides minimal assistance with adjustment challenges. This situation forces Matilda to develop alliances with servants and other household members who can offer practical advice and emotional support. The economic responsibilities of medieval wives extend far beyond simple household management to encompass complex financial decision-making that can significantly impact family prosperity. You watch as Matilda learns to evaluate the quality and pricing of goods purchased for the household, negotiate contracts with craftspeople and suppliers, and manage the intricate systems of credit and debt that govern relationships with neighbouring families. Her decisions about resource allocation and investment priorities will influence the family's economic position for years to come. The social dimensions of married life require young wives to master the art of entertaining guests, maintaining family honour through appropriate hospitality, and navigating the complex political relationships that determine their husband's success in feudal society. You observe Matilda's first attempt to organise a formal dinner for visiting nobles, where every detail of food preparation, table arrangement, and conversational management reflects on her family's status and sophistication. The pressure to perform flawlessly in these situations creates ongoing anxiety for inexperienced hostesses. Historians still argue whether the extensive responsibilities of medieval wives actually provided them with significant power and autonomy within their households, or whether these duties simply represented additional forms of unpaid labour that benefited their husbands' interests rather than their own. The religious obligations of married women create additional layers of responsibility that require careful balance between spiritual devotion and practical household management. You follow Matilda as she attends daily mass, supervises religious instruction for household children, manages charitable obligations to local poor families, and maintains the chapel and religious artifacts that demonstrate her family's piety. These activities consume significant time and resources while providing opportunities for spiritual fulfillment and social connection. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life create constantly changing demands on wives who must adapt their management strategies to agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and religious calendar requirements that govern household activities throughout the year. You observe how Matilda's responsibilities shift dramatically between harvest season, when food preservation becomes critical, and winter months, when textile production and indoor crafts occupy most household energy. Learning to anticipate and prepare for these cyclical changes requires experience that new wives often lack. The medical responsibilities of medieval wives encompass everything from basic first aid and herbal remedies to complex obstetrical care and epidemic management that can determine life and death outcomes for entire households. You watch as Matilda receives instruction in identifying medicinal plants, preparing therapeutic preparations, and recognizing symptoms of common diseases that threaten medieval families. This medical knowledge often proves more valuable than formal education in determining a wife's usefulness and respect within her community. The diplomatic aspects of married life require wives to serve as intermediaries between their birth families and their husbands' relatives, managing relationships that can significantly influence political alliances and economic opportunities. You observe how Matilda must carefully balance loyalty to her father's interests with commitment to her new family's welfare, particularly when these loyalties conflict during disputes or negotiations. Her success in managing these relationships can determine whether her marriage strengthens or undermines both families' positions. The reproductive expectations surrounding married women create constant pressure to conceive and bear healthy children who will ensure dynastic continuity and political security. You witness Matilda's anxiety about her monthly cycles and the elaborate rituals she performs to encourage fertility, while managing the fear that reproductive failure could result in marriage annulment or replacement by a more fertile wife. The medieval emphasis on reproductive success transforms women's bodies into contested territory where personal health intersects with political necessity. The legal status of married women creates complex situations where wives must understand their rights and obligations within legal systems that often treat them as extensions of their husbands rather than independent individuals. You discover that Matilda retains certain property rights related to her dowry, while losing control over most other aspects of her legal identity. Learning to navigate these restrictions while protecting her interests requires sophisticated understanding of legal principles and practical strategies for influencing decisions nominally made by male relatives. The cultural adjustments required by medieval marriage often prove more challenging than practical responsibilities, particularly for wives who must adapt to households with different regional backgrounds, social customs, or religious practices than their birth families. You observe Matilda struggling to understand the Germanic traditions that govern her husband's family celebrations, food preferences, and social relationships, while also maintaining connections to the Norman customs of her childhood. These cultural negotiations require diplomatic skills and emotional flexibility that determine whether marriages thrive or merely survive. As evening approaches and Matilda completes her first full day as a married woman, you witness the gradual emergence of confidence and competence that will eventually transform this anxious young bride into a capable household manager and political partner. The overwhelming challenges of early married life test every aspect of her intelligence, creativity, and resilience, but also provide opportunities for growth and achievement that would be impossible within the more limited roles available to unmarried women in medieval society. You find yourself in the shadowed halls of a legal scholar's chamber, where ancient scrolls and modern parchments document the dramatic transformation that marriage creates in a woman's legal identity, essentially erasing her independent existence and folding her into her husband's juridical persona like a drop of water dissolving into the ocean. The morning light illuminates dusty tomes containing Roman law, canon law, and emerging feudal customs that govern how marriage instantly reshapes a woman's relationship to property, contracts, inheritance, and even criminal responsibility in ways that would seem incomprehensible to anyone living outside the medieval legal universe. Do you remember watching Matilda navigate her new household responsibilities and social relationships during those first challenging days of married life? Now you discover the profound legal changes that occurred the moment she spoke her wedding vows, transformations so complete that the law literally considers her former self to have ceased existing as an independent legal entity. The doctrine of coverture, borrowed from Roman legal traditions and refined by medieval jurists, declares that husband and wife become one person in law, and that person is the husband. The property implications of medieval marriage create one of history's most dramatic examples of legal transformation, where women who may control substantial wealth and extensive estates as unmarried daughters or widows find themselves legally powerless to manage even personal possessions once they become wives. You examine elaborate legal documents that trace how Matilda's dowry lands, personal jewellery, and even her clothing technically become her husband's property, though complex contractual arrangements attempt to preserve some measure of her control over assets her family provided for her security and comfort. The intellectual sophistication of medieval property law reveals itself in the intricate mechanisms developed to balance competing interests while maintaining the fiction of male authority over married women's assets. You discover fascinating legal innovations like the marriage portion, which remains technically under the husband's control while being legally designated for the wife's exclusive use, and paraphernal goods, which married women can manage independently despite their general legal incapacity. These distinctions demonstrate remarkable legal creativity in protecting women's interests within patriarchal systems. But the practical enforcement of these property protections often depends more on family relationships and social pressure than formal legal mechanisms, creating situations where theoretically protected assets become vulnerable to mismanagement or outright theft by unscrupulous husbands. You observe cases where women with extensive legal protections still lose control over their property, because courts consistently favour husbands' interpretations of ambiguous contractual language. The gap between legal theory and practical reality often leaves even wealthy women financially vulnerable, despite elaborate protective arrangements. The contractual implications of marriage extend far beyond property, to encompass a married woman's complete inability to enter into binding agreements, borrow money, or conduct business transactions without her husband's explicit consent and participation. You watch as Matilda discovers that she cannot even purchase fabric for new clothing without Lord Reginald's approval, despite the fact that her dowry provided the funds for such purchases. This legal incapacity creates practical difficulties for women who must manage complex household economies while lacking independent authority to make necessary business decisions. The inheritance rights of married women reflect medieval society's complex attempts to balance family interests, female protection, and male authority through legal mechanisms that often create more confusion than clarity. You examine inheritance laws that simultaneously recognize women's rights to inherit from their birth families while limiting their ability to control inherited property or transfer it to their own children without their husband's involvement. These restrictions create multi-generational complications as property rights become entangled with marriage relationships across multiple family lines. The criminal law implications of coverture produce some of medieval jurisprudence's most bizarre and troubling consequences, where married women's legal non-existence creates situations that seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. You discover that married women cannot be held independently responsible for many crimes because the law assumes they act under their husband's direction and authority. This doctrine can protect women from punishment for actions they were forced to take, but it also means they cannot seek independent legal redress for wrongs committed against them. Historians still argue whether medieval marriage laws actually protected women by ensuring male responsibility for their welfare, or whether these legal frameworks simply institutionalized female subordination while providing theoretical protections that proved meaningless in practice. The ecclesiastical law governing married women creates parallel legal systems that sometimes conflict with secular regulations, producing jurisdictional disputes that can determine whether women receive protection or punishment for identical actions. You observe cases where secular courts and ecclesiastical tribunals reach different conclusions about married women's legal capacity, creating opportunities for forum shopping that savvy women can exploit to protect their interests. The Church's emphasis on spiritual equality sometimes translates into more favourable legal treatment than secular law provides. The regional variations in marriage law demonstrate the complex patchwork of legal traditions that govern medieval women's lives, with some jurisdictions providing significantly better protection for married women's interests than others. You discover that English common law develops relatively progressive mechanisms for protecting married women's property rights, while Germanic legal traditions emphasize male authority more strongly. These variations create strategic considerations for families negotiating international marriages, where different legal systems might apply to the same relationship. The documentation requirements for married women's legal transactions create elaborate bureaucratic processes designed to ensure that husbands genuinely consent to their wives' actions, while protecting women from later claims that they exceeded their authority. You examine legal documents where married women's signatures appear alongside their husbands' acknowledgements, creating paper trails that demonstrate compliance with coverture requirements while preserving evidence of women's actual participation in family decision-making. The business implications of married women's legal incapacity create significant practical problems for families engaged in commerce, where effective business management often requires rapid decision-making that formal consent requirements can complicate or delay. You observe how merchant families develop informal practices that allow married women to conduct routine business while maintaining the appearance of male authority that legal requirements demand. These adaptations demonstrate practical flexibility within seemingly rigid legal frameworks. The international aspects of married women's legal status create complex jurisdictional questions when families have holdings in multiple countries with different legal traditions governing female property rights and contractual capacity. You discover cases where the same woman might have different legal capacities depending on which court has jurisdiction over particular disputes, creating strategic opportunities for legal manipulation that sophisticated families learn to exploit. The enforcement mechanisms for protecting married women's legal interests reveal the limited effectiveness of formal protections when social attitudes and institutional biases consistently favour male authority over female rights. You observe how even women with extensive legal protections often find courts reluctant to enforce contractual provisions that limit husbands' control over family assets. The cultural assumption that men naturally possess superior judgment in financial matters undermines legal frameworks designed to protect women's interests. The evolution of married women's legal status during the medieval period reflects broader changes in social attitudes, economic conditions, and political structures that gradually create more sophisticated protections while maintaining fundamental assumptions about male authority and female subordination. You witness how legal innovations like dower rights and jointure arrangements attempt to address obvious inequities while preserving patriarchal control over family resources and decision-making authority. The educational requirements for understanding married women's legal status create significant barriers for women who must navigate complex legal systems without formal training in law or access to independent legal counsel. You observe how families attempt to educate daughters about their legal rights and protections, though this education often proves inadequate when women face sophisticated legal challenges that require professional expertise they cannot obtain independently. As you close the heavy legal tomes and extinguish the candles in the scholar's chamber, the magnitude of legal transformation that marriage creates becomes unmistakably clear. The young woman who entered her wedding ceremony with whatever legal capacity unmarried status provided emerges as a legal nonentity whose very existence depends on her husband's continued goodwill and competent management of her interests. Yet within these seemingly impossible constraints, you've also discovered remarkable innovations and adaptations that demonstrate human creativity in protecting vulnerable individuals within systems designed primarily to serve other interests and priorities. You enter the hushed stillness of a medieval lady's private chapel, where morning prayers mingle with desperate whispered pleas for divine intervention in the most pressing concern of married life. The overwhelming expectation to bear children that will secure dynastic succession, political alliances, and personal security in a world where barren wives face potential abandonment, annulment, or replacement by more fertile women. The flickering votive candles illuminate prayer books worn smooth by anxious fingers, while herb gardens visible through leaded windows reveal the elaborate botanical preparations that medieval women employ in their relentless quest to fulfill reproductive obligations that define their worth and determine their fate. The fertility pressures you observe encompass far more than simple desire for children. They reflect the fundamental reality that medieval marriage exists primarily to produce legitimate heirs who will inherit property, continue family lines, and maintain the political relationships that govern feudal society. You watch as Matilda, now 18 months into her marriage, anxiously calculates the timing of her monthly cycles while consulting with midwives about herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and prayer rituals that might encourage conception after more than a year of disappointing results. The medical knowledge surrounding fertility in medieval times blends sophisticated empirical observation with elaborate superstitions that create complex treatment protocols for women struggling with reproductive challenges. You discover fascinating remedies that include surprisingly effective herbal preparations alongside bizarre practices like sleeping with mandrake roots under the mattress or consuming powdered unicorn horn mixed with blessed wine. The desperation driving these practices reflects the enormous stakes involved when fertility failure can destroy marriages, political alliances, and entire family futures. The social pressure surrounding childless marriages intensifies over time as families, communities, and political allies begin questioning whether unions that produce no heirs serve any useful purpose in medieval society's dynastic calculations. You observe how conversations gradually shift from polite inquiries about Matilda's health to pointed suggestions about potential remedies, alternative arrangements, or even marriage annulment if reproductive failure continues. The weight of these expectations transforms private intimate experiences into public political concerns that involve entire extended family networks. But medieval understanding of reproductive biology demonstrates both remarkable insight and dangerous ignorance that can lead to treatments ranging from genuinely helpful to actively harmful. You listen as learned physicians explain humoral theory's application to fertility problems, recommending dietary changes, bloodletting, and herbal preparations based on principles that often produce accurate results despite fundamentally flawed theoretical foundations. The gap between empirical success and theoretical understanding creates medical traditions that work without anyone understanding why. The role of divine intervention in medieval fertility beliefs creates elaborate religious practices designed to secure heavenly assistance for reproductive success through prayers, pilgrimages, relics, and charitable works that demonstrate spiritual worthiness for the blessing of children. You follow Matilda on an exhausting pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Brigid, patron of fertility, where she joins hundreds of other women seeking divine intervention for reproductive challenges while leaving offerings of jewelry. clothing, and precious objects as evidence of their sincere devotion. The economic implications of childless marriages extend beyond inheritance concerns to encompass the immediate practical problems of maintaining political alliances and social relationships that depend on demonstrable fertility for continued validity. You discover how families begin reducing investments in relationships that appear unlikely to produce the next generation of heirs needed to maintain inter-family connections. Childless wives gradually find themselves excluded from social networks as their political value diminishes with each passing year. The psychological toll of fertility pressure often proves as devastating as any physical reproductive challenges, creating cycles of anxiety and depression that can actually interfere with conception while generating additional stress about personal inadequacy and spiritual unworthiness. You observe Matilda's increasing social isolation as she begins avoiding public events where pregnant women and new mothers might remind her of her own reproductive failures. The shame associated with childlessness creates emotional burdens that compound the practical difficulties of medieval marriage. Historians still argue whether medieval fertility treatments actually improved conception rates, or whether the psychological benefits of believing in potential solutions provided the primary therapeutic value for women facing reproductive challenges. The alternative solutions available to childless couples reveal fascinating insights into medieval attitudes about adoption, fostering, and non-biological family relationships that could potentially satisfy dynastic requirements while addressing fertility limitations. You discover cases where couples arrange to raise nephews or nieces as potential heirs, though these arrangements often create legal complications about inheritance rights and family succession that can generate conflicts lasting generations. The flexibility of medieval kinship systems provides options that modern nuclear family concepts often exclude. The magical practices surrounding fertility demonstrate the persistence of pre-Christian traditions that medieval church authorities attempt to suppress, while often incorporating them into sanctified Christian rituals that serve similar psychological functions. You observe women secretly performing ancient rituals involving moon phases, sacred springs, and fertility symbols while publicly participating in Christian ceremonies that invoke saints and biblical precedents for miraculous conception. These parallel belief systems provide multiple avenues for hope and therapeutic intervention. The dietary and lifestyle modifications recommended for fertility enhancement reveal sophisticated understanding of nutrition's impact on reproductive health, combined with elaborate theories about bodily humours and spiritual influences that create comprehensive treatment protocols addressing physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of fertility challenges. You watch as Matilda carefully follows complex dietary restrictions while taking herbal preparations and engaging in specific exercise routines designed to optimize her body's reproductive capacity. The social support networks available to women facing fertility challenges vary dramatically based on family attitudes, regional customs, and individual circumstances, with some women receiving extensive emotional and practical assistance while others endure reproductive struggles in relative isolation. You observe how Matilda's mother-in-law initially provides helpful advice and herbal remedies, but gradually becomes more critical and distant as months pass without conception. Reflecting the conditional nature of family support when reproductive success remains uncertain, the international trade in fertility remedies creates fascinating markets for exotic substances, rare herbs, and blessed objects that supposedly enhance reproductive capacity through magical or divine intervention. You discover how medieval commerce networks facilitate the exchange of fertility treatments across vast distances, with merchant families importing rare spices, precious stones, and religious relics specifically for women seeking reproductive assistance. The global nature of these markets demonstrates the universal character of fertility concerns. The timing strategies employed by medieval couples attempting to optimize conception reveal sophisticated understanding of reproductive cycles, combined with astrological calculations and religious calendar considerations that create elaborate protocols for sexual activity designed to maximize fertility potential. You observe how Matilda and Lord Reginald carefully coordinate their intimate activities with lunar phases, feast days, and seasonal changes that various authorities recommend for successful conception. The documentation of fertility struggles in medieval records provides fascinating glimpses into private family concerns that rarely appear in formal historical sources, revealing the enormous emotional and practical investment that families make in addressing reproductive challenges. You examine private letters where women share remedies, offer encouragement, and document their experiences with various treatments in ways that create informal networks of medical knowledge and emotional support. The legal implications of prolonged childlessness create complex questions about marriage validity, inheritance rights, and family obligations that can determine whether reproductive failure results in personal tragedy or broader family catastrophe. You discover cases where childless marriages face annulment proceedings based on claims of divine displeasure or inadequate consummation, though these legal challenges often reflect political motivations rather than genuine concerns about reproductive capacity. As moonlight filters through the chapel windows and Matilda completes another night of desperate prayers for divine blessing on her womb, you witness the profound vulnerability that fertility expectations create for medieval women whose personal worth, social status, and physical security depend on their ability to perform reproductive functions that remain largely beyond their control. The weight of dynastic expectations transforms the most intimate aspects of marriage into sources of anxiety and potential failure that can overshadow every other achievement or contribution these remarkable women make to their families and communities. You find yourself standing in the hushed atmosphere of a medieval church, where black-draped mourners gather around a wooden coffin, witnessing one of the most paradoxical moments in a woman's medieval journey. The death of a husband that simultaneously creates devastating grief and unexpected liberation, transforming wives into widows who suddenly possess legal rights, economic independence, and social freedoms that married women can never experience. The tolling bells echo through stone corridors as you observe how death reshapes the entire landscape of feminine possibility. Though this newfound autonomy comes wrapped in vulnerability, uncertainty, and social pressures that can prove as constraining as marriage itself, the immediate aftermath of widowhood reveals the complex legal and practical transformations that occur when coverture suddenly ends, and women regain independent legal existence they may not have possessed for decades. You watch as Lady Catherine de Montfort, recently widowed at 32 after 14 years of marriage, meets with legal advisors who explain how her husband's death instantly restores her capacity to own property, enter contracts, conduct business, and make decisions that required his consent throughout their marriage. The restoration of legal personhood feels both liberating and terrifying for women unprepared for sudden independence. The economic implications of widowhood create enormous variations in women's experiences based on the financial arrangements made during marriage, the existence of surviving children, and the provisions of wills that can determine whether widows emerge wealthy and independent or impoverished and vulnerable. You observe how Catherine's relatively favourable circumstances — she controls substantial dower lands and receives generous provisions from her husband's estate — contrasts sharply with the situation of peasant widows who may face immediate destitution when their husbands' deaths eliminate the primary source of family income. The dower system provides medieval society's primary mechanism for protecting widows' economic security, guaranteeing women lifetime control over approximately 1/3 of their deceased husband's lands, while establishing complex legal relationships with their husband's heirs who will eventually inherit these properties. You examine intricate legal documents that balance widows' immediate needs against family succession requirements, creating arrangements that can provide substantial security while generating potential conflicts between widows and their stepchildren or other relatives. But the social status of widowhood creates fascinating contradictions where women simultaneously gain legal capacity and lose social protection, becoming independent agents in a world designed for male authority and female subordination. You observe how Catherine must learn to navigate business relationships, legal proceedings, and political negotiations without the male intermediaries who previously represented her interests. This independence requires developing skills and confidence that many women have never needed while married. The religious dimensions of widowhood reflect medieval Christianity's complex attitudes toward female sexuality, spiritual devotion, and social relationships that create both opportunities and constraints for women whose husbands' deaths eliminate their primary social roles. You listen as priests counsel Catherine about the spiritual benefits of maintaining chaste widowhood, while acknowledging the practical pressures that may encourage remarriage. The Church's idealization of celibate widowhood often conflicts with economic realities that make remarriage essential for survival. The remarriage pressures surrounding medieval widows demonstrate how quickly society attempts to restore women to married status, viewing independent widowhood as an inherently unstable condition that threatens social order and economic relationships. You watch as potential suitors begin approaching Catherine within months of her husband's death, attracted by her wealth and established household management skills while calculating how marriage to an experienced widow might advance their own interests. The courtship of widows often proves more explicitly mercenary than arrangements for first marriages. The advantages that the experienced widows possess in remarriage negotiations create opportunities for much more favourable second marriages, where women's proven fertility, household management competence, and accumulated wealth provide leverage unavailable to young brides entering the marriage market for the first time. You observe how Catherine's advisors help her evaluate potential second husbands with careful attention to how remarriage might affect her children's inheritance rights, her personal autonomy, and her control over property accumulated during her first marriage. Historians still argue whether medieval widowhood actually provided women with their only opportunity for genuine independence and self-determination, or whether social and economic pressures made this apparent freedom largely illusory for most women. The maternal responsibilities of widowed mothers create complex situations where women must balance their own interests against their children's welfare, while protecting family property and managing inheritance rights that can determine their offspring's future prosperity. You watch as Catherine struggles with decisions about her 14-year-old son's education and marriage prospects, while managing estates that will eventually become his inheritance but remain under her control during his minority. These responsibilities require diplomatic skills and business acumen that many women develop only through necessity. The regional variations in widowhood customs demonstrate how different legal traditions and cultural attitudes create dramatically different experiences for women whose husbands die in various parts of medieval Europe. You discover that English common law provides relatively generous dower provisions and legal protections for widows, while some Germanic traditions emphasize family control over widows' remarriage decisions. These variations create strategic considerations for families arranging marriages across regional boundaries. The age factors influencing widowhood experiences create distinct categories of widows with different opportunities, challenges, and social expectations based on their life stages when their husbands die. You compare Catherine's situation as a relatively young widow with substantial child-rearing responsibilities to that of elderly widows who may possess greater accumulated wealth but fewer remarriage options. The intersection of age, wealth, and family circumstances creates diverse pathways through widowhood that resist simple generalizations. The property management responsibilities that widowhood suddenly imposes on women often prove overwhelming for individuals whose previous experience was limited to household management rather than estate administration, commercial investments, or legal negotiations. You observe Catherine receiving intensive education in agricultural management, tenant relations, and commercial law from advisors who recognize her need for knowledge that her husband previously provided. This crash course in business and legal matters demonstrates both the complexity of medieval estate management and women's capacity for rapid learning when circumstances require it. The social networks available to widows create crucial support systems that can determine whether independent life proves feasible or impossibly isolated for women attempting to manage complex responsibilities without traditional male protection and guidance. You watch as Catherine develops relationships with other widows, sympathetic male relatives, and professional advisors who provide practical assistance and emotional support during her transition to independent life. These networks often prove more valuable than formal legal protections in determining actual outcomes. The political implications of widowhood can significantly impact broader family and regional relationships when widows control substantial resources or strategic properties that affect military alliances, commercial relationships, or succession disputes. You observe how Catherine's decisions about estate management and potential remarriage influence political calculations involving multiple noble families who view her choices as affecting their own interests. The intersection of personal decisions and political consequences creates enormous pressure on widows whose private choices carry public implications. The cultural representations of widowhood in medieval literature, religious instruction, and popular culture create competing models for appropriate widow behavior that range from pious retirement from worldly concerns to active engagement in business and politics that might challenge gender norms. You discover how these cultural narratives influence actual widows' self-perception and social acceptance while providing justification for various approaches to managing independent life. The legal protections available to widows vary dramatically based on family relationships, regional customs, and individual circumstances, with some women receiving extensive support, while others face exploitation or abandonment by relatives who view their independence as threatening or inconvenient. You observe cases where widows must actively defend their rights against male relatives who attempt to control their property or force unwanted remarriages that would serve family interests rather than the widow's welfare. As evening shadows lengthen, across the churchyard where Catherine's husband rests in his stone tomb, you witness her transformation from grief-stricken wife to determined independent woman who must navigate freedoms and responsibilities that feel both exhilarating and terrifying. The paradox of widowhood, simultaneous liberation and vulnerability, captures the broader contradictions of medieval women's lives, where legal capacity and social acceptance remain perpetually in tension, creating opportunities for remarkable achievement alongside constant reminders of the precarious nature of female independence in a world designed primarily for male authority and control. You embark on a journey across the medieval European landscape where regional customs create a fascinating tapestry of marriage traditions that vary so dramatically between England, France, Germany, and the Mediterranean that a young woman's experience of matrimony might be utterly transformed simply by crossing political boundaries or moving between cultural zones. The morning mist rises from the English Channel as you witness how geographic location determines not just the language of wedding vows, but the fundamental legal rights, social expectations, and personal freedoms that marriage provides or denies to women navigating the complex world of medieval matrimony. The English approach to marriage customs demonstrates the unique blend of Anglo-Saxon traditions, Norman innovations, and emerging common law principles that create relatively progressive protections for married women while maintaining traditional hierarchies of male authority. You observe wedding ceremonies in Yorkshire where brides retain unusual rights to reuse marriages even after betrothal contracts are signed, a custom rooted in ancient Saxon law that persists despite Norman attempts to impose more restrictive continental practices. The English emphasis on individual consent, while often theoretical, creates legal frameworks that occasionally provide genuine protection for women seeking to escape unwanted unions. The French marriage traditions you encounter reveal the sophisticated influence of courtly culture, Roman law revival, an ecclesiastical authority that produces elaborate ceremonial practices emphasizing romantic ideals alongside practical political considerations. You witness a noble wedding in Aquitaine where troubadour songs celebrate the bride's beauty and virtue, while legal scholars debate the finer points of dowry law and inheritance rights according to principles derived from Justinian's code. The French synthesis of emotional expression and legal precision creates marriage customs that acknowledge both human feelings and dynastic necessities. The Germanic marriage practices demonstrate the persistence of tribal customs that emphasize family honor, military alliances, and community approval in ways that create distinctly different experiences for women marrying within Germanic cultural zones. You observe ceremonies in Bavaria where the bride's family must formally transfer guardianship to the groom's relatives through ritualized combat demonstrations that symbolically prove the new family's ability to protect their female member. These warrior traditions create marriage customs that emphasize physical protection and martial prowess in ways that Mediterranean cultures find crude and barbaric. But the Mediterranean marriage customs reveal the complex influence of classical Roman traditions, Islamic legal concepts, and Byzantine ceremonial practices that create some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated approaches to managing the intersection of marriage and propriety and political relationships. You witness elaborate wedding celebrations in Venice, where merchant families negotiate marriage contracts that span multiple pages and address complex commercial relationships extending across international trade networks. The Mediterranean emphasis on commercial sophistication creates marriage practices that treat wives as genuine business partners rather than simply domestic managers. The documentation requirements for marriage vary so dramatically between regions that the same couple might find their union legally valid in one jurisdiction while being considered unmarried in another, creating complex problems for families with holdings spanning multiple cultural and legal zones. You examine cases where English couples married, according to local customs, find their marriages questioned by French courts applying different legal standards. While Germanic law recognizes unions that Mediterranean authorities consider canonically invalid, these jurisdictional conflicts create ongoing uncertainty for international marriages. The dowry systems operating in different regions reveal fascinating variations in how families transfer wealth between generations, while protecting women's economic interests within marriage relationships. You discover that English dower traditions emphasize widows' rights to lifetime support from their deceased husbands' estates, while Germanic customs focus more on immediate property transfers that give wives direct control over specific assets. French practices create complex hybrid arrangements that attempt to balance competing legal traditions, while Mediterranean systems often include sophisticated commercial investments that provide ongoing income rather than simple property ownership. The age expectations for marriage demonstrate significant regional variations that reflect different cultural attitudes about childhood, maturity, and optimal timing for reproductive responsibilities. You observe that Germanic tribes often expect earlier marriages for girls who must begin bearing children immediately to replace casualties from constant warfare, while Mediterranean merchant families may delay marriages until young women have acquired sufficient education and commercial skills to manage complex business relationships. These cultural differences create situations where a girl considered too young for marriage in one region might be viewed as dangerously close to spinsterhood in another. Historians still argue whether regional variations in marriage customs actually provided medieval women with meaningful choices about their matrimonial experiences, or whether different traditions simply offered various forms of male dominance disguised as cultural diversity. The religious influences on marriage customs create additional layers of regional variation as different areas maintain distinct relationships with church authority and varying degrees of compliance with canonical requirements. You discover that remote Germanic regions often ignore papal decrees about marriage practices while maintaining ancient pagan traditions barely disguised as Christian ceremonies, while areas closer to Rome demonstrate much stricter adherence to ecclesiastical law. These variations create opportunities for couples to seek jurisdictions that provide more favourable treatment for their particular circumstances. The economic foundations of different regional marriage systems reflect the underlying agricultural, commercial, and military structures that shape how families accumulate and transfer wealth through matrimonial arrangements. You observe how English manorial systems create marriage customs focused on land tenure and agricultural productivity, while Mediterranean commercial networks produce practices emphasizing liquid capital and international trade relationships. Germanic warrior societies develop traditions that prioritize military equipment and strategic alliances, while French courtly culture creates customs that value cultural sophistication and artistic patronage. The linguistic aspects of regional marriage variations demonstrate how different languages create distinct vocabularies for discussing matrimonial relationships, with some cultures possessing elaborate terminology for various types of marriage arrangements, while others maintain relatively simple categorizations. You discover that Germanic languages include multiple words for different types of bride prices and dowry arrangements, while Romance languages develop sophisticated legal terminology for describing complex property relationships. These linguistic differences reflect and reinforce cultural variations in how societies conceptualize marriage relationships. The seasonal and timing customs surrounding marriages reveal how different climates, agricultural cycles, and cultural celebrations create regional patterns that determine when couples can marry and how wedding celebrations integrate with broader community activities. You observe that Northern European traditions often schedule marriages around harvest festivals and military campaign seasons, while Mediterranean customs align wedding timing with commercial cycles and religious festivals. These patterns create migration flows as families seek optimal timing and locations for matrimonial celebrations. The architectural and ceremonial settings for marriages demonstrate how different regional building traditions and artistic styles create distinct experiential contexts for wedding ceremonies that can significantly influence participants' emotional responses and social perceptions. You witness ceremonies in Gothic cathedrals that emphasize divine transcendence and spiritual aspiration, while Mediterranean weddings in classical basilicas suggest continuity with ancient Roman traditions. Germanic ceremonies in wooden halls emphasize community solidarity and warrior values, while French courtly celebrations in elaborate chateaux demonstrate aristocratic refinement and cultural sophistication. The legal enforcement mechanisms for marriage customs vary dramatically between regions with different governmental structures, creating situations where identical marriage violations might receive completely different treatments depending on local authority systems. You discover that areas with strong royal courts provide more consistent enforcement of marriage laws, while regions dominated by local nobles or tribal authorities often maintain traditional practices regardless of official legal requirements. These enforcement variations create practical differences in how marriage customs actually affect women's daily experiences. The international marriage markets that develop between different regions create fascinating opportunities for families to exploit beneficial aspects of various legal and cultural systems while avoiding less favourable local customs. You observe how wealthy families strategically arrange marriages across regional boundaries to access better property laws, more favourable inheritance customs, or superior legal protections for their daughters. These cross-cultural arrangements require sophisticated knowledge of multiple legal systems and cultural expectations. As your journey across medieval Europe concludes with sunset over the Alps, you've witnessed how geographic location determines not just the language in which women speak their wedding vows, but the fundamental nature of the lives those vows create, demonstrating that medieval marriage represents not a single institution, but a complex array of regional variations that offer dramatically different opportunities, constraints, and experiences for women navigating matrimony within the rich cultural diversity of European civilization. You find yourself in the marble corridors of a papal palace where learned clerics engage in heated theological debates that will reshape the very foundation of Christian marriage, while simultaneously observing the practical negotiations in noble castles where secular families continue arranging unions based on political necessity rather than spiritual idealism. The tension between these two worlds creates one of medieval history's most fascinating conflicts: the ongoing battle between church doctrine that emphasizes spiritual equality, mutual consent, and divine blessing, versus secular family arrangements that prioritize dynastic survival, political alliances, and economic advantage in ways that often directly contradict religious teachings about the sacred nature of matrimonial bonds. The ecclesiastical revolution in marriage doctrine begins with Pope Gregory VII's reforms in the 11th century, which attempt to establish clerical control over all aspects of matrimony, while introducing theological concepts that fundamentally challenge existing social practices. You observe as church scholars develop elaborate theories about marriage as a sacrament that requires divine grace, mutual consent, and spiritual preparation that goes far beyond the practical considerations that have governed matrimonial arrangements for centuries. These theological innovations create immediate conflicts with noble families who view marriage primarily as a tool for managing property transfers and political relationships. The practical enforcement of church marriage doctrine proves nearly impossible when ecclesiastical ideals clash with the basic survival needs of feudal society, creating ongoing tensions between religious authorities who preach spiritual requirements and secular families who must navigate the harsh realities of medieval political competition. You witness heated confrontations between bishops who demand compliance with canonical marriage laws and noble fathers who argue that church requirements would destroy their family's ability to maintain essential political alliances and economic relationships. The consent requirements that the Church champions create particularly complex problems for families accustomed to arranging marriages based on strategic considerations rather than personal preferences. You observe how religious authorities insist that both bride and groom must freely agree to marriage, while families continue pressuring young people to accept arrangements that serve broader dynastic interests. The theoretical requirement for consent becomes a theological fiction that provides moral cover for practices that remain essentially unchanged despite official church disapproval. But the Church's emphasis on spiritual equality between husband and wife introduces revolutionary concepts that slowly begin influencing how couples understand their relationships. Even when practical circumstances prevent immediate implementation of these idealistic principles, you listen as progressive clerics argue that marriage creates partnerships between spiritual equals who share responsibility for each other's salvation, challenging traditional assumptions about male authority and female subordination that have governed matrimonial relationships since ancient times. The secular response to church marriage doctrine reveals sophisticated strategies for maintaining traditional practices while appearing to comply with religious requirements through careful legal maneuvering and selective interpretation of canonical principles. You watch as noble families develop elaborate mechanisms for ensuring parental control over marriage decisions while creating the appearance of voluntary consent that satisfies ecclesiastical authorities. These adaptations demonstrate remarkable creativity in reconciling conflicting requirements from religious and secular authorities. The jurisdictional conflicts between church and secular courts create ongoing disputes about which authority has ultimate control over marriage validity, annulment proceedings, and related property disputes that can determine family fortunes and political relationships. You observe cases where couples seek annulments from ecclesiastical courts that secular authorities refuse to recognize, creating legal uncertainties that can persist for decades while affecting inheritance rights and political alliances. These jurisdictional battles reflect broader struggles between religious and secular authority that define medieval political development. The theological sophistication of church marriage doctrine develops through centuries of scholarly debate that produces increasingly complex theories about the spiritual dimensions of matrimony, while often losing contact with the practical realities that most couples actually experience. You examine elaborate treatises that discuss marriage as a mystical union reflecting Christ's relationship with the Church, while providing little guidance for managing the everyday challenges of medieval domestic life. The gap between theological idealism and practical necessity creates ongoing frustrations for both religious and secular authorities. Historians still argue whether the Church's intervention in marriage practices actually improve women's status and protection, or whether religious involvement simply added another layer of male authority that complemented rather than challenged existing patriarchal control over matrimonial decisions. The economic implications of the religious-secular conflict over marriage create significant practical problems for families who must navigate competing requirements that can affect property transfers, inheritance rights, and commercial relationships in unpredictable ways. You discover cases where church annulments invalidate secular marriage contracts in ways that disrupt carefully planned property arrangements and political alliances, creating economic chaos that can affect multiple generations. The uncertainty created by competing authorities makes long-term family planning extremely difficult. The regional variations in how different areas balance religious and secular marriage requirements reflect the complex political relationships between local church authorities and secular rulers who may emphasize different aspects of matrimonial law depending on their own interests and circumstances. You observe that areas with strong episcopal authority tend to enforce church marriage doctrine more strictly, while regions dominated by powerful secular nobles often maintain traditional practices, regardless of religious disapproval. These variations create inconsistent enforcement that couples can sometimes exploit their advantage. The educational aspects of the religious-secular conflict introduce ordinary people to sophisticated theological and legal concepts about marriage that gradually influence popular understanding of matrimonial relationships, even when practical circumstances prevent immediate changes in actual behaviour. You listen as parish priests explain church teachings about mutual consent and spiritual equality while parishioners continue arranging marriages according to traditional family considerations. This gradual educational process plants intellectual seeds that will eventually grow into more significant social changes. The diplomatic implications of the religious-secular marriage conflict affect international relationships, when different countries emphasize different approaches to matrimonial law in ways that can complicate cross-border alliances and diplomatic marriages. You discover cases where marriages that are valid according to one country's secular law are considered invalid by another nation's ecclesiastical authorities, creating international incidents that require careful diplomatic resolution. These conflicts demonstrate how marriage law becomes entangled with broader political relationships. The literary and cultural expressions of the religious-secular marriage conflict produce fascinating artistic works that explore the tensions between spiritual idealism and practical necessity through romantic narratives, theological treatises, and popular songs that influence how ordinary people understand matrimonial relationships. You encounter courtly romances that celebrate passionate love as spiritually meaningful while acknowledging the practical impossibility of choosing marriage partners based purely on emotional attraction. These cultural productions help ordinary people process the contradictions they experience in their own lives. The enforcement mechanisms available to religious and secular authorities reveal the limited power that either institution possesses to control marriage practices when couples and families are determined to pursue their own interests regardless of official requirements. You observe how church authorities can refuse to perform marriage ceremonies but cannot prevent secular celebrations, while secular authorities can control property transfers but cannot force spiritual recognition of unions that violate canonical law. These limitations force both institutions to seek accommodation rather than total victory. The long-term consequences of the religious-secular marriage conflict gradually transform medieval society by introducing concepts of individual rights, spiritual equality, and personal autonomy that will eventually challenge the entire feudal system's emphasis on collective obligations and hierarchical authority. You witness how seemingly abstract theological debates about marriage consent and spiritual partnership plant intellectual foundations for the broader social changes that will reshape European civilization over the following centuries. The accommodation strategies that develop between religious and secular authorities create hybrid systems that attempt to satisfy both spiritual requirements and practical necessities through complex compromises that acknowledge the legitimate concerns of both institutions while recognizing the limitations of their respective authority. You observe the emergence of elaborate procedures that provide religious blessing for politically necessary marriages while maintaining theoretical adherence to church doctrine about consent and spiritual preparation. As candlelight flickers across the faces of theologians and politicians still engaged in their endless debates about marriage authority, you witness how this fundamental conflict between spiritual idealism and practical necessity will continue shaping European society for centuries, creating ongoing tensions between individual desires and collective needs that define not just matrimonial relationships but the broader development of Western civilization's approach to balancing religious principles with political requirements in an imperfect world. You descend from the marble halls of nobility into the earthy reality of medieval villages where the vast majority of women experience marriage according to customs and constraints that differ dramatically from the elaborate ceremonies and legal protections available to their aristocratic counterparts. The morning sun illuminates thatched cottages, where peasant families gather around rough wooden tables to arrange marriages based on immediate survival needs rather than political dynasties, while merchant households in bustling market towns develop their own distinctive approaches to matrimony that balance commercial considerations with emerging urban social structures. The practical realities of peasant marriage reveal how economic necessity shapes matrimonial customs when families possess little property to transfer and few political connections to maintain through strategic alliances. You observe how Sarah the miller's daughter meets her future husband Thomas the blacksmith through daily work interactions rather than formal negotiations, with their family's primary concerns focusing on whether the union will create a viable household economy capable of supporting children and elderly relatives. The absence of substantial dowries simplifies marriage arrangements while creating different types of pressure related to immediate economic survival. The timing of lower-class marriages often depends more on seasonal agricultural cycles and economic opportunities than on abstract considerations about optimal age or formal readiness for adult responsibilities. You watch as peasant families coordinate wedding celebrations with harvest festivals when food supplies are abundant and community members have leisure time for celebration, while also ensuring that new households can be established before winter weather makes construction and relocation difficult. These practical considerations create marriage patterns that reflect the rhythms of rural life rather than aristocratic social calendars. The consent issues that create such theological and legal complexity for noble families often prove less problematic for peasant couples who typically know each other through community interactions and may even choose their own partners from among locally available options. You discover that while peasant women certainly face family pressure to marry appropriately, the limited pool of potential spouses and the necessity for couples to work together effectively often result in marriages based on genuine compatibility and mutual attraction. The absence of distant political considerations allows for more personal factors to influence matrimonial decisions, but the economic vulnerabilities of lower-class marriage create different types of hardship that can prove more immediately devastating than the political pressures facing noble wives. You observe how a peasant woman's marriage security depends entirely on her husband's continued health and economic productivity, with illness, injury, or death creating immediate destitution that no elaborate legal protections can prevent. The absence of substantial family wealth means that personal catastrophes translate directly into family disasters without the buffering effects that aristocratic resources provide. The legal status of peasant wives reveals how social class affects the practical application of marriage law, with lower-class women often possessing fewer formal protections while simultaneously experiencing greater informal autonomy within their communities. You discover that peasant wives may lack access to sophisticated legal remedies for marriage problems, but they also face less restrictive oversight of their daily activities and business decisions. The informal nature of peasant economic relationships often allows women more practical independence than formal legal frameworks might suggest. The merchant class marriage customs demonstrate fascinating innovations that emerge when families accumulate substantial wealth through commercial activities rather than land ownership, creating new approaches to dowries, business partnerships, and international relationships that challenge traditional aristocratic practices. You observe how wealthy merchant families in Venice develop marriage contracts that include provisions for wives to participate directly in commercial enterprises, recognizing that business success often requires active involvement from all family members, regardless of traditional gender restrictions. The urban marriage patterns you encounter reveal how city life creates different social dynamics and economic opportunities that influence matrimonial customs in ways that both challenge and reinforce traditional rural practices. You watch as craft guild families arrange marriages that consider professional skills and business connections, alongside traditional factors like dowries and family reputation, with young women's abilities in textile production, food preparation, or commercial calculation becoming important factors in marriage negotiations. The urban emphasis on specialized skills creates new forms of female value that complement traditional domestic roles. The religious observance of lower-class marriages often proves more genuine and less politically motivated than aristocratic ceremonies, though the simpler celebrations may lack the elaborate theological sophistication that characterizes noble weddings. You witness touching ceremonies in village churches where couples exchange vows with obvious sincerity, while their communities provide modest but heartfelt celebrations that emphasize spiritual blessing and community support rather than political alliance and social display. These authentic expressions of religious devotion often prove more moving than elaborate aristocratic pageantry. Historians still argue whether lower social status actually provided medieval women with more authentic autonomy and genuine partnership within marriage, or whether the absence of formal protection left peasant and merchant wives more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse than their aristocratic counterparts. The seasonal and cyclical nature of lower-class marriage celebrations reflects the agricultural and commercial rhythms that govern rural and urban communities, creating patterns of matrimonial activity that align with economic prosperity and community leisure, rather than abstract social calendars. You observe how harvest festivals provide natural occasions for wedding celebrations, while commercial fairs create opportunities for merchant families to arrange marriages that will strengthen business relationships. These natural timing patterns often produce more joyful and community-integrated celebrations than artificially scheduled aristocratic events. The childbearing expectations for lower-class wives focus more on immediate practical contributions to household labour and economic productivity than on abstract dynastic considerations, creating different types of pressure that may prove more manageable for young mothers. You watch as peasant wives integrate childcare with agricultural work and domestic production in ways that make reproductive responsibilities feel like natural extensions of their existing roles rather than completely separate obligations. The absence of elaborate succession planning often makes pregnancy and childbearing less politically fraught for lower-class women. The widowhood experiences of peasant and merchant women reveal both greater vulnerability and surprising resilience compared to aristocratic widows who possess more formal protections, but may lack practical skills for independent survival. You observe how peasant widow's immediate survival depends on her ability to maintain agricultural production or continue commercial activities, but successful management of these responsibilities can provide genuine independence and community respect. The absence of elaborate legal complications often makes widowhood transitions more straightforward for lower-class women. The education and preparation for marriage that lower-class girls receive emphasizes practical skills and community integration, rather than the formal instruction in household management and political diplomacy that characterizes aristocratic female education. You watch as young peasant women learn essential skills through daily participation in family economic activities, while developing social relationships that will support them throughout their married lives. This practical education often proves more useful for actual marriage success than the theoretical instruction available to noble daughters. The international and migration aspects of lower-class marriage create interesting patterns of cultural exchange and adaptation as peasant and merchant families move between regions for economic opportunities while maintaining matrimonial customs that may blend traditions from multiple areas. You discover how mobile artisan families develop flexible marriage practices that can adapt to different regional requirements while preserving essential cultural elements that maintain family identity across geographic boundaries. The documentation of lower-class marriages often proves minimal compared to the elaborate records maintained for aristocratic unions. But surviving evidence reveals fascinating insights into how ordinary people understand and experience matrimonial relationships without the distorting effects of political pressure and dynastic calculation. You examine simple marriage contracts that focus on immediate practical arrangements while expressing genuine affection and mutual commitment in language that often proves more moving than elaborate aristocratic legal documents. The community support systems available to lower-class married couples often prove more reliable and personally meaningful than the formal institutional protections available to aristocratic families, with neighbours, relatives, and professional colleagues providing practical assistance and emotional support that helps couples navigate marriage challenges. You observe how village communities and craft guilds create informal networks of mutual aid that can provide more effective protection for women facing marriage difficulties than distant legal authorities who may be influenced by political considerations rather than personal welfare. As evening shadows fall across the village commons where peasant families gather for their simple but heartfelt wedding celebrations, you witness how authentic human emotions and practical cooperation can create successful marriages even within the constraints of poverty and social limitation, demonstrating that love, respect, and mutual support often prove more valuable than wealth, status, and political protection in determining whether matrimonial relationships provide happiness and fulfillment for the ordinary people who constitute the vast majority of the medieval society. You stand at the threshold between medieval darkness and Renaissance dawn, watching as the marriage customs that have governed women's lives for centuries begin their slow transformation into practices that will eventually evolve into modern matrimonial traditions. Though this evolution unfolds across generations rather than years, carrying forward essential elements while gradually discarding others in response to changing social conditions, economic structures, and intellectual developments that reshape European civilization itself. The morning light of the 14th century illuminates wedding ceremonies that still echo with ancient rituals while incorporating innovations that hint at future possibilities for female autonomy, romantic choice, and personal fulfillment within marriage relationships. Do you remember the elaborate political negotiations, religious controversies, and practical challenges that you witnessed throughout this journey into medieval marriage customs? Now you observe how these complex traditions begin adapting to new circumstances as the rigid feudal system gradually gives way to more flexible social structures that create different opportunities and constraints for women navigating matrimony in an evolving world. The transformation happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, but its cumulative effect will eventually revolutionize how couples meet, court, marry, and relate to each other within their communities. The intellectual developments of the later medieval period introduce concepts of individual worth, personal choice, and romantic love that gradually influence marriage practices, even though practical circumstances continue limiting most women's actual autonomy in matrimonial decisions. You witness the emergence of courtly literature that celebrates passionate attachment between spouses while acknowledging the continuing reality of arranged marriages based on family considerations. These cultural innovations plant seeds of change that will eventually flower into more significant social transformations during the Renaissance and beyond. The economic changes accompanying the growth of commercial cities, international trade, and monetary systems create new forms of wealth that challenge traditional aristocratic dominance while providing alternative pathways to social advancement through successful business enterprises rather than land ownership and military service. You observe how merchant families develop marriage customs that emphasize commercial partnerships and business skills alongside traditional considerations about family connections and social status, creating hybrid practices that bridge medieval and modern approaches to matrimony. The religious Reformation movements that emerged during the 14th and 15th centuries introduced new theological perspectives on marriage that emphasize spiritual partnership and mutual responsibilities while challenging some traditional assumptions about male authority and female subordination within matrimonial relationships. You listen as reformist preachers argue for marriages based on genuine affection and shared spiritual goals rather than purely political or economic calculations. Though these ideas remain largely theoretical for most couples whose circumstances continue requiring practical rather than romantic approaches to partner selection, but the gradual strengthening of royal authority and centralized legal systems begins creating more consistent enforcement of marriage laws, while reducing the arbitrary power of local nobles to override individual preferences in matrimonial arrangements. You witness how emerging national courts provide alternative venues for marriage disputes that can sometimes protect women's interests more effectively than traditional feudal authorities who may be influenced by local political considerations rather than abstract legal principles. The technological innovations that begin transforming medieval society create new economic opportunities and social possibilities that gradually expand women's roles beyond traditional domestic responsibilities while providing alternative sources of personal fulfillment and family income. You observe how improvements in agricultural techniques, textile production, and commercial transportation create economic niches where women's skills and labour become increasingly valuable, slowly shifting the balance of power within households and communities in ways that will eventually influence marriage relationships. The demographic changes resulting from plague, warfare, and economic disruption create labour shortages and social instability that force communities to become more flexible about traditional gender roles and marriage customs when survival requires adaptation to changed circumstances. You discover how the devastating population losses of the 14th century create situations where women must assume responsibilities traditionally reserved for men, while marriage arrangements must adapt to reduced pools of potential spouses and altered economic conditions. Historians still argue whether the transformation of medieval marriage customs actually improved women's status and opportunities, or whether changing practices simply created new forms of limitation and control that replaced traditional constraints with more subtle but equally restrictive modern expectations. The international influences that increasingly affect European society through expanded trade, diplomatic contact, and cultural exchange introduce new ideas about marriage relationships from Byzantine, Islamic, and other traditions that challenge purely Western European approaches to matrimonial customs. You observe how these cross-cultural contacts gradually introduce concepts about female education, property rights, and marital relationships that provide alternative models for thinking about women's roles within marriage and society. The artistic and literary developments of the late medieval period create new cultural representations of marriage that emphasize emotional satisfaction, personal compatibility, and individual happiness alongside traditional concerns about family honor and economic security. You witness how emerging Renaissance art forms celebrate married love as spiritually meaningful and personally fulfilling rather than simply socially necessary, creating cultural support for marriage practices that consider individual welfare alongside collective needs. The legal innovations that developed during the transition from medieval to early modern periods create more sophisticated protection for women's property rights, inheritance claims, and personal safety within marriage, while maintaining essential features of male authority and family hierarchy. You examine how legal scholars develop increasingly complex frameworks for balancing competing interests and protecting vulnerable individuals while preserving social stability in traditional relationships. The educational developments that begin expanding literacy and intellectual opportunities for women create possibilities for greater personal autonomy and informed decision-making about marriage choices. Though these opportunities remain limited to relatively privileged social groups, while the majority of women continue experiencing matrimony according to traditional customs and constraints. You observe how educated women begin developing new strategies for negotiating marriage relationships and protecting their interests within existing legal and social frameworks. The urban growth that characterizes the later medieval period creates new social environments where traditional marriage customs must adapt to different living conditions, economic structures, and community relationships that challenge rural and aristocratic assumptions about appropriate matrimonial practices. You watch as city-dwelling families develop marriage customs that reflect urban realities while maintaining connections to traditional rural practices that continue governing the majority of the population. The technological and scientific developments that begin transforming medieval understanding of medicine, agriculture, and natural philosophy gradually influence marriage practices by providing new knowledge about fertility, childbirth, and family health that affects how couples plan and manage their reproductive lives. You discover how improved medical knowledge creates new possibilities for family planning and maternal survival, while introducing scientific approaches to problems that medieval society had previously addressed through religious or magical remedies. The political developments that gradually centralize authority and create more stable governmental institutions provide alternative sources of protection and legal recourse for women facing marriage difficulties. Though these innovations primarily benefit privileged social groups, while ordinary people continue relying on traditional community support systems, you observe how emerging national legal systems create new opportunities for appealing local marriage decisions while introducing bureaucratic complications that can delay or complicate resolution of matrimonial disputes. As twilight settles over this medieval world that you have explored so thoroughly, you witness the gradual emergence of practices and attitudes that will eventually evolve into modern marriage customs, while recognizing how many fundamental elements of contemporary matrimonial relationships trace their origins to the complex medieval traditions that governed women's lives for centuries. The elaborate dowry negotiations transform into modern prenuptial agreements. The Church's emphasis on mutual consent evolves into contemporary requirements for voluntary marriage. The medieval struggle between romantic desire and practical necessity continues influencing modern couples who must balance emotional satisfaction with economic security and family obligations. The young women whose stories you have followed through betrothal, marriage, and widowhood represent countless generations of human beings who navigated love, duty, and survival within systems that often constrain their choices, while occasionally providing unexpected opportunities for fulfillment and achievement. Their experiences remind us that human resilience, creativity, and adaptability can create meaningful lives even within circumstances that seem impossibly restrictive to modern sensibilities, while also demonstrating how gradual social change can eventually transform even the most established traditions, when changing conditions require new approaches to eternal human needs and desires. The legacy of medieval marriage customs echoes through contemporary society in wedding traditions that celebrate ancient rituals, legal frameworks that protect individual rights while acknowledging family relationships, and cultural expectations that continue balancing romantic idealism with practical considerations about compatibility, economic security, and social appropriateness. The medieval synthesis of spiritual meaning, practical necessity, and human emotion within matrimonial relationships provides a foundation upon which subsequent generations have continued building approaches to marriage that attempt to serve both individual happiness and collective welfare in an imperfect but persistently hopeful world. The gentle rhythm of your breathing slows as these ancient stories settle into your consciousness, like autumn leaves drifting to rest upon still water. The flickering candles in medieval chambers grow dim as centuries collapse into moments of understanding. You have walked through time itself, witnessing love and duty intertwine in patterns as complex as the illuminated manuscripts that preserved these tales. The young brides whose stories you followed fade into the soft mist of memory, their courage and resilience echoing through the corridors of time like whispered prayers in empty cathedrals. Let their strength become your peace tonight. Let their adaptability inspire your dreams of possibility. The weight of their struggles transforms into gentle wisdom as you release the day's tensions and allow sleep's embrace to carry you into the timeless realm where all stories find their rest. The medieval world of arranged marriages and political alliances dissolves into the universal human experience of seeking love, security, and meaning within the constraints and possibilities that each generation inherits and transforms. Close your eyes now and drift into that peaceful space where history becomes dream, where the past offers comfort rather than burden, where the endless human story of love and survival continues in the rhythm of your quiet breathing. The bells of medieval churches ring softly across the centuries, calling you home to rest. Sweet dreams await in the gentle darkness where all the brides of history have found their peace, and where you too shall find the restoration that night promises to all who seek its quiet sanctuary.